At his housewarming party, my son allowed his wife to throw my late wife's handmade quilt into the fireplace. She declared that trash does not belong in her mansion. I pulled it out with my bare hands. I took it to the seamstress anyway. Her hands started trembling as she asked if I knew what was sewn inside it. My name is Harlan Cole. I am 69 years old, and I spent my entire life building a foundation of quiet sacrifice for a son who ultimately viewed me as an expendable asset. As a retired forensic auditor, I spent 30 years dissecting the financial crimes of arrogant men. I never expected my greatest investigation to involve my own flesh and blood. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The bass from the string quartet echoed through the towering glass doors of Jared and Megan's new estate in the hills. The mansion was a monstrous monument to sudden tech wealth. It was all sharp angles, cold marble, and floor-to-ceiling windows designed to display their status to the world below. I stood on the pristine circular driveway wearing my best charcoal suit. I bought it 10 years ago for an anniversary dinner with my late wife Esther. It was meticulously pressed, but the lapels were undeniably out of fashion. The valet attendants in their crisp vests rushed past me to open the doors of arriving luxury sports cars. They ignored the old African-American man standing near the entrance. I did not mind the slight. I held a large plain cardboard box against my chest. Inside was the only thing of true value I had left to give. It was a quilt Esther had sewn entirely by hand during the final months of her battle with illness. Every stitch was a testament to a woman who possessed an intellect far greater than anyone realized. I pushed through the heavy front doors and stepped into the sprawling foyer. The air was thick with the scent of expensive catering and the hollow laughter of venture capitalists. Men in tailored jackets and women in designer gowns stood in tight circles holding crystal champagne flutes. I navigated through the crowd, feeling the sudden weight of their stares. My presence was an immediate disruption to their curated aesthetic. I spotted Jared standing near a massive marble island in the open kitchen. My son was 35 years old, but he wore the arrogant smirk of a man who believed he had conquered the world entirely on his own. He was the CEO of a booming tech startup celebrated in financial magazines for a revolutionary data algorithm. I knew the absolute truth about that algorithm. Esther was the brilliant software engineer who laid the foundation for modern data architecture in the quiet solitude of our basement. Jared simply took the credit after she died. Before I could reach my son, a sharp voice cut through the ambient noise. Megan materialized from the crowd, her high heels clicking aggressively against the polished stone floor. My daughter-in-law was 32 years old, draped in a backless silk gown that cost more than my first car. Her blonde hair was styled perfectly, but her eyes held a familiar, calculating cruelty. She despised my humble roots. She viewed my existence as a dark stain on the flawless, wealthy image she was desperately trying to project. She stepped directly into my path, forcing me to stop. She looked me up and down, her gaze lingering on the slightly frayed cuffs of my suit jacket. She let out a short, derisive sigh. "I told Jared to hire a private driver for you so you would not arrive looking like you just got off a public bus," she said. Her voice was loud enough for the nearest guests to hear. The ambient chatter around us immediately ceased. I kept my posture straight and offered a polite nod. "I drove myself, Megan," I replied evenly. "I brought a housewarming gift for the two of you." I extended the cardboard box toward her. Jared noticed the sudden silence and walked over to join his wife. He looked at me, then at the plain box, and a flash of profound embarrassment crossed his face. He did not greet me. He simply asked what I was doing there so early. Before I could answer, Megan snatched the box from my hands. She tore off the lid with dramatic flair, expecting perhaps a piece of fine crystal or a vintage bottle of wine. Instead, she pulled out the folded fabric. The quilt was a patchwork of deep blues, rich reds, and muted golds. It was a masterpiece of devotion. Megan held it up by the corners, letting it unfold completely. She dangled it in the air as if she were holding a contaminated rag. "What exactly is this supposed to be, Harlan?" she asked, her tone dripping with venomous mockery. I looked at Jared, waiting for him to intervene, waiting for him to recognize the fabric from his mother's old dresses. He looked away, staring firmly at the marble floor. "That is your mother-in-law's final creation," I said calmly. Esther spent 4 months sewing that for Jared. She wanted it to be in his first true home. Megan let out a sharp theatrical laugh that echoed through the silent room. "A raggedy old blanket," she announced to her audience of wealthy friends. This is a multi-million-dollar smart home, Harlan. We do not use thrift store scraps to decorate. She turned sharply on her heels and marched toward the center of the living room. A massive, gas-fed wood fireplace roared behind a sleek glass screen. Megan slid the glass open. The intense heat radiated into the room. She turned back to look at me, a wicked smile playing on her lips. "Trash does not belong in my mansion," she declared. She tossed the quilt directly into the roaring flames. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. I did not yell. I did not curse her name. In that fraction of a second, the emotional shock transmuted into a state of hyper-focused clarity. As a forensic auditor, I spent decades dissecting the wreckage of corporate greed. I learned early on that you must endure the initial burn to secure the evidence. Pain is merely a biological response, an alert system that can be overridden by sheer force of will. I stepped forward, closing the distance in 3 long strides. Jared finally reached out, making a weak attempt to grab my shoulder, but I shoved him aside effortlessly. I lunged toward the open fireplace. I plunged my bare hands directly into the raging fire. The heat was instantaneous and absolute. I felt the fine hairs on my arms singe and vanish. The blistering heat seared the skin of my knuckles, but I did not flinch. I grabbed the thickest part of the quilt. The edges were already catching fire, curling into black ash. I gripped the heavy fabric and yanked it backward with brutal force. I threw the smoking bundle onto the pristine white rug, stamping out the glowing embers with my heavy dress shoes. The smell of burning cotton and singed flesh filled the opulent living room. I stood up slowly. The skin on my palms was bright red, tightening painfully, but my face remained an unreadable mask. I picked up the smoldering quilt, holding it tightly against my chest. The soot stained the crisp white fabric of my dress shirt. I turned to look at my son. Jared stood frozen in the center of the room. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes wide with a pathetic mixture of shock and cowardice. He had watched his wife attempt to incinerate his mother's legacy, and he had done absolutely nothing to stop her. "You have shown me exactly who you are," I said softly. My voice cut through the silence with the precision of a scalpel. I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on the lavish party, ignoring the stunned faces of the tech elites. I walked out of the mansion, my footsteps heavy and deliberate against the marble floor. I pushed through the front doors and stepped out into the cool night air. The physical pain in my hands was beginning to throb, a sharp, pulsing agony that demanded attention. I ignored it. The pain of my son's betrayal was vastly superior to any physical wound. I reached my old, reliable sedan parked at the edge of the sprawling driveway. I carefully placed the burned quilt onto the passenger seat. As I reached into my pocket for my keys, my phone vibrated twice. I pulled it out and looked at the illuminated screen. It was a text message from Jared. There was no apology. There was no concern for my burned hands. The message was cold, calculated, and entirely transactional. "Move out of the old house by Monday," he wrote. "I am selling the land to cover startup costs. Do not make this difficult." I stared at the glowing words in the darkness. He thought he was evicting a helpless old man. He had no idea he had just ignited a war he could never win. I drove my sedan through the quiet suburban streets. The familiar hum of the engine was the only sound breaking the thick silence inside the car. The pain in my hands was a dull, constant throb, but I gripped the steering wheel with absolute precision. My focus was entirely on the scorched bundle resting on the passenger seat. The smell of burned cotton lingered in the confined space. I pulled into the small parking lot behind Loretta's tailoring shop. The neon sign in the window hummed, casting a faint red glow onto the pavement. I grabbed the quilt and walked toward the back entrance. Loretta had been Esther's closest friend for nearly 40 years. She was a woman who understood the language of fabric and the silent histories woven into every seam. I knew she would still be working. She always stayed late on Thursdays to finish rush orders. I knocked twice on the heavy steel door. A moment later, the deadbolt clicked and the door swung open. Loretta stood in the doorway, a measuring tape draped around her neck and a pair of reading glasses perched on her forehead. She looked at me, then down at the ruined fabric in my arms. Her expression shifted immediately from surprise to deep concern. She ushered me inside without asking a single question. The shop smelled of starch, hot iron, and old wood. It was a comforting, familiar scent that sharply contrasted with the sterile arrogance of Jared's mansion. I set the quilt down on her large cutting table. Loretta traced her fingers over the blackened edges. Her touch was incredibly gentle. She did not ask how it happened. She simply asked what I needed her to do. I told her to salvage whatever she could. I explained that the edges were destroyed, but the center panels might still be intact. Loretta nodded and adjusted her glasses. She picked up a pair of heavy fabric scissors and began to carefully snip away the charred lining. The sound of the blades cutting through the ruined cotton was sharp and rhythmic in the quiet shop. I stood beside the table watching her work with practiced efficiency. Esther had spent the last 4 months of her life working on this quilt. She sat in her armchair by the living room window, her hands moving with a steady, determined grace even as her illness progressed. Jared rarely visited during those months. He was too busy building his company, too consumed by the sudden influx of venture capital. Esther never complained. She simply kept sewing. I always assumed the quilt was a final gesture of unconditional maternal love. I believed she was weaving her forgiveness into the fabric, offering her son a piece of comfort he did not deserve. I was entirely wrong. Loretta continued cutting away the damaged sections. She moved toward the thickest part of the quilt, the central panel that featured a complex geometric pattern Esther had designed herself. Loretta's scissors suddenly struck something hard. The metallic click was loud and unmistakable. Loretta stopped cutting. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with confusion. She carefully pulled back the layers of cotton batting. Deep inside the quilt, completely hidden from the outside, was a flat silver heat-proof pouch. Loretta slowly extracted the pouch. It was slightly larger than a standard envelope and surprisingly heavy. Her hands started to tremble as she held it out to me. She asked me, her voice barely a whisper, if I knew what Esther had sewn inside. I took the pouch from her hands. The material felt cool and rigid against my blistered palms. I stared at the sealed flap, a sudden, profound realization washing over me. Esther was an engineer. She built systems with multiple layers of security and fail-safes. She never left anything to chance. She knew exactly who her son was, and she had prepared a contingency plan. I broke the seal on the pouch. My heart beat with a slow, heavy rhythm. I reached inside and pulled out 2 items. The first was a small, ornate brass key. It looked old, heavy, and completely out of place. The second item was a folded stack of thick, legal-sized paper. I placed the key on the cutting table and unfolded the document. It was a notarized certificate of ownership. I scanned the first page, my eyes tracking the dense legal jargon. It was a master patent. The technical diagrams and the algorithmic formulas were incredibly complex, but I recognized the core structure immediately. It was the exact predictive algorithm that powered Jared's entire company. The algorithm was the sole reason his startup was valued in the tens of millions. It was the technology that secured his venture capital and financed his sprawling mansion. I flipped to the final page of the document. The signature at the bottom was clear and undeniable. The patent was not registered to Jared's company. It was not registered to any corporate entity. It was registered solely to Esther Cole. I read the attached addendum. Esther had granted Jared a conditional operating license to use the technology. She had given him the tools to succeed, but she had never surrendered ownership. The terms of the license were explicit and uncompromising. The document stated that the license would be immediately revoked if Jared engaged in any legal or financial actions that threatened my security or well-being. It specifically detailed that upon revocation, absolute control of the patent would automatically transfer to me. I placed the document next to the brass key. The silence in the tailoring shop felt entirely different now. It was no longer a heavy, oppressive quiet. It was the silence of absolute clarity. Jared believed he had built an empire. He believed he held all the power. He had thrown his mother's legacy into a fire, completely unaware that he had just attempted to burn the very foundation of his own wealth. Loretta watched me, her hands resting on the edge of the table. She asked me what it was. I looked at the brass key and the legal documents. I told her it was a silent adjustment. I carefully placed the documents and the key back into the heat-proof pouch. I thanked Loretta for her help and asked her to keep the quilt safe until I returned. She nodded, her expression grim but understanding. I walked out of the shop and got back into my car. The pain in my hands was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating energy. Jared had sent me a text demanding I move out of my own home by Monday. He intended to sell the land to fuel his arrogant ambitions. He had fired the first shot, but he was entirely unarmed. I started the engine. It was time to find out exactly what the brass key opened. I needed to visit the central bank first thing in the morning. I pulled out of the parking lot, the plan already forming with meticulous precision in my mind. The sun had barely broken over the horizon when I parked my sedan outside the central branch of the First National Bank. The morning air was crisp and cold against my face. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel with rigid determination. The skin across my knuckles and palms was a landscape of angry red blisters from the fireplace, sending constant waves of sharp pulsing pain up my forearms. I welcomed the pain. It was a grounding force. It kept my mind perfectly sharp. As a forensic auditor, I spent my entire career tracking down hidden assets and dismantling the complex lies of arrogant men. I knew how to separate emotion from strategy. I stepped out of the car and walked up the heavy stone steps of the bank. I carried a worn leather briefcase and the heavy brass key Loretta had extracted from the scorched quilt. The bank lobby was silent and completely empty of other customers at this early hour. I approached the main desk and presented my identification along with the brass key to the vault manager. He was an older man with graying hair who scrutinized my face, then looked down at my heavily bandaged hands. He did not ask questions. He simply checked my credentials against the bank registry, nodded, and led me toward the heavy steel doors of the underground vault. We descended a quiet staircase. The air in the basement was cool and smelled of polished metal and old paper. The manager guided me down a long corridor of metal boxes until we stopped at number 412. He inserted his master key into the first slot. I inserted Esther's brass key into the second slot. We turned them simultaneously. The heavy lock clicked open. The manager pulled the metal box from the wall, handed it to me, and escorted me to a private windowless viewing room. He closed the heavy wooden door behind him, leaving me in absolute silence. I set the metal box onto the mahogany table. My heart beat with a slow, heavy rhythm. I lifted the lid. Inside lay a single thick manila folder, completely devoid of any external markings. I pulled the folder out and opened it. The first thing I saw was my late wife's flawless, elegant handwriting on the margins of a dense legal document. Esther had always been meticulous. She was a brilliant software engineer who preferred the quiet solitude of her basement office over the aggressive spotlight of the tech industry. She spent the last 4 months of her life writing the code for a predictive data algorithm while her body failed her. I knew the algorithm was powerful. I never realized the absolute genius of the legal fortress she built around it. I began to read the documents. My forensic training immediately kicked in, processing the complex legal structures and corporate bylaws. Jared claimed he built his entire tech startup from scratch. He presented himself to venture capitalists as a visionary founder who wrote the core technology. The documents in my hands proved that his entire narrative was a complete fabrication. Esther had established a private holding trust 2 months before her death. She registered the master patent for the algorithm under this trust, designating herself as the sole creator and owner. She never surrendered the intellectual property to Jared. She merely granted his newly formed company an exclusive conditional operating license. Jared was nothing more than a glorified tenant renting the engine that powered his multi-million-dollar empire. I turned to the third page of the licensing agreement. Esther had highlighted a specific section in yellow ink. It was an ethics and conduct clause. The legal language was explicit and completely uncompromising. It stated that the operating license was granted to Jared strictly on the condition that he maintained a fiduciary and moral duty to the primary beneficiary of the trust. I looked at the beneficiary designation. My name, Harlan Cole, was printed in bold letters. The clause further detailed the exact conditions for automatic revocation. If the licensee Jared initiated any legal or financial action designed to displace Harlan Cole from his primary residence, or if the licensee committed any documented act of elder abuse, the operating license would be immediately and permanently terminated. All rights, permissions, and access to the algorithm would instantly revert to the total control of Harlan Cole. I stared at the page. The sheer brilliance of my late wife brought a sudden stinging moisture to my eyes. Esther knew her son. She recognized the unchecked greed and the arrogant cruelty festering inside him long before the cancer took her. She knew that once she was gone, Jared would eventually view me as a useless burden. She had constructed a flawless legal trap and handed me the detonator. By demanding that I move out of the family home to sell the land and by allowing his wife to destroy my property in a fireplace, Jared had completely violated the core conditions of the agreement. He had triggered the revocation clause himself. His company was now an empty shell. He owned nothing but leased office space and false promises. I owned the entire foundation of his wealth. I carefully placed the documents back into the manila folder and locked the metal box. I called the vault manager to return the box to the wall, securely placing the brass key and the folder into my briefcase. I walked out of the bank with my posture straight and my shoulders pulled back. The bright morning sunlight washed over me. I was no longer a discarded father trying to survive the humiliation of a ruthless son. I was the absolute executioner of my wife's final will. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, but I knew I could not reveal my hand yet. I needed to execute this takeover with the same cold, calculating precision I used to dismantle corporate fraud. The adrenaline that had fueled me through the morning began to recede as I walked back to my car. The severe burns on my hands flared with a fresh, demanding agony. The blisters were tight, weeping slightly against the crude bandages I had applied at home. I needed medical-grade burn ointment and sterile gauze to prevent infection. I drove 3 blocks down the street and parked in front of a local pharmacy. I walked down the brightly lit aisles, keeping my head down to avoid the stares of other shoppers. I selected a tube of high-grade silver sulfadiazine cream, a box of non-stick sterile pads, and a roll of medical tape. I approached the checkout counter. The cashier was a young woman who politely kept her eyes averted from my raw, blistering skin. She scanned the items and stated the total. I reached into my wallet with trembling fingers and pulled out my debit card. It was linked to the joint account where my monthly pension was deposited. I inserted the chip into the card reader. The machine processed the request for a few seconds. A sharp negative beep rang out. The screen flashed a red error message indicating the transaction was declined. The cashier offered an apologetic smile and suggested I try the card again. I knew my pension deposit had cleared successfully 3 days ago. There was more than enough money to cover a $30 pharmacy purchase. I removed the card, wiped the chip on my jacket, and inserted it a second time. The machine beeped again. Declined. I told the cashier to hold the items for a moment. I stepped out of the checkout line and moved to a quiet corner near the front windows. I pulled out my smartphone and logged into my banking application. A bold red banner stretched across the top of my account dashboard. The notification stated that the account was completely restricted. I tapped on the alert to read the details. The screen revealed that the secondary account holder had flagged the account for suspicious activity. The flag specifically cited suspected cognitive decline and erratic financial behavior by the primary account holder. Jared had weaponized the banking system against me. He had used his status on the account to freeze my access to my own pension. He was not simply waiting for me to move out of the old house. He was actively cutting off my ability to buy food, medicine, and basic necessities. He intended to starve me into submission, so I would be forced to surrender my property to him immediately. My son was trying to crush me into dust. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. My hands burned, but my mind was absolute ice. The massive glass doors of Omniscient Technologies parted silently as I stepped into the hyper-modern lobby. The walls were clad in seamless white marble, and a massive digital waterfall cascaded down the wall behind the reception desk. This was the empire Jared believed he had built. I walked across the polished floor. My hands were heavily wrapped in sterile white gauze, a glaring contrast to my dark suit. The young woman at the reception desk offered a practiced, hollow smile. I told her I was Harlan Cole, Jared's father, and I needed to see him immediately. She typed furiously on her keyboard, her smile faltering slightly. She asked me to wait in the designated guest area. I sat on a low-profile, minimalist leather sofa. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I recognized the tactic. It was a calculated delay designed to make me feel small and insignificant in his domain. I remained perfectly still. A lifetime of forensic audits had taught me that impatience was a weakness. Finally, the elevator doors chimed. It was not Jared who stepped out, it was Megan. She wore a tailored ivory pantsuit that projected an aggressive, sterile authority. Her blonde hair was pulled back tightly. She carried a thin leather portfolio and a small white paper bag. She walked across the lobby with purposeful strides, her heels clicking sharply against the stone. She stopped in front of the sofa, looking down at me with an expression of thinly veiled contempt. She did not offer a greeting. She dropped the paper bag onto the low glass table in front of me. It landed with a dull thud. "Jared is extremely busy today, Harlan," she announced. Her voice was loud enough for the receptionist to hear. "He asked me to handle this unfortunate situation. You must be hungry. I brought you a sandwich." The condescension was thick and deliberate. I looked at the grease-stained paper bag, then back at her face. I did not speak. Megan sighed, pulling out one of the leather chairs across from me and sitting down. She crossed her legs and opened her portfolio. She slid a thick, multi-page legal document across the glass table. "We are all aware of the incident with your bank account," she said. Her tone was smooth-laced with a venomous kind of pity. Jared is simply trying to protect you. Your behavior at the housewarming party was alarming. Plunging your bare hands into a fire over a piece of trash is not the action of a mentally stable man." She gestured toward my bandaged hands with her manicured fingers. "You are clearly deteriorating, Harlan. This document is a comprehensive power of attorney. It grants Jared full conservatorship over your finances and medical decisions." I stared at the document. The bold legal header declared a total surrender of my autonomy. Megan leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "If you sign this right now, Jared has authorized me to provide you with a modest monthly stipend. It will be enough to cover your basic groceries and utilities at the old house. We will even arrange for a weekly nurse to check on your burns. If you refuse, the account remains permanently frozen. You will have absolutely nothing. You are a stubborn old man, but you cannot survive on pride." I analyzed her face. I had sat across interrogation tables from hundreds of corporate embezzlers and white-collar criminals. I knew the exact anatomy of an extortion attempt. Megan believed she held all the leverage. She believed I was a desperate, impoverished pensioner terrified of starvation. She did not know that I had spent the last 48 hours dissecting the absolute fraud of her husband's entire corporate existence. I leaned forward slightly. The movement caused a sharp flare of pain in my knuckles, but I kept my face expressionless. "I need a pen to sign the document," I stated quietly. My voice was raspy, intentionally frail. Megan's eyes lit up with predatory triumph. She quickly reached into her portfolio. She pulled out a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. I recognized it immediately. It was a custom Mont Blanc, a gift Jared bought for himself to celebrate his first $1 million funding round. She placed the pen on top of the power of attorney document. I picked up the pen with my bandaged right hand. The smooth metal was difficult to grip through the gauze. I did not move toward the signature line on the legal document. Instead, I reached out and pulled a small square cocktail napkin from beneath the water glass on the table. I uncapped the pen. I pressed the gold nib against the soft paper. I wrote out a 12-digit alphanumeric sequence. I wrote it slowly, ensuring every number and letter was perfectly legible despite my restricted grip. I capped the pen and placed it neatly next to the napkin. I did not touch the power of attorney document. I stood up from the low sofa. Megan frowned, her triumphant smile faltering. "What are you doing, Harlan?" "Sign the paper," she demanded, her voice rising in frustration. I looked down at her. "Give that napkin to your husband," I said. I turned and walked toward the exit. I did not look back as the massive glass doors parted. I stepped out onto the busy downtown sidewalk. The midday sun was bright, casting sharp shadows across the pavement. I had barely reached the corner of the block when my phone began to vibrate violently in my pocket. I did not answer it. I knew exactly what was happening inside that lobby. Jared had finally descended from his executive suite. He had walked over to where his wife sat, fuming. He had picked up the napkin. I knew the exact moment his eyes registered the 12 digits. The sequence was the official federal registration number for the predictive data algorithm patent. It was the absolute core of his company, the singular asset that guaranteed his wealth. By writing those numbers, I demonstrated that I had found the hidden documents. I proved that I knew the truth about Esther's trust. I proved that his entire empire was built on a conditional license that I now had the power to detonate. The phone stopped vibrating, then immediately started again. The incoming caller ID displayed Jared's private office line. I let it ring. He was experiencing the sudden, terrifying realization that his starvation tactic had completely failed. He had attempted to freeze my meager pension, entirely unaware that I held the absolute power to freeze his multi-million-dollar corporation. The dynamic had officially inverted. I hailed a passing taxi. I instructed the driver to take me to the law offices of Bradley Vance. The first phase of the silent adjustment was complete. It was time to initiate the financial blockade. Jared stares at the 12 digits I wrote on the cocktail napkin. He recognizes the federal registration number instantly. His custom Mont Blanc pen slips from his trembling fingers and clatters against the polished mahogany of his executive desk. He spent the last 4 years building a flawless narrative of self-made genius. He told venture capitalists, financial magazines, and his own wife that he wrote the core architecture of the data algorithm from scratch. He buried his mother's original paperwork deep in a basement archive, assuming his father was too technologically illiterate and too emotionally defeated to ever find it. The realization hits him with the force of a physical blow. Harlan is not a senile old man. Harlan is a retired forensic auditor. Harlan spent 30 years hunting men exactly like Jared. Men who built glittering castles on stolen land. Jared picks up his phone. His hands are shaking violently. He bypasses his corporate security team and calls a private number. He hires an independent private investigator. He orders the investigator to monitor every single movement his father makes. He demands daily photographs, GPS locations, and a comprehensive list of anyone Harlan speaks to. Jared believes he can anticipate his father's next move. He believes money can buy foresight. He believes he can trap me before I strike. He is completely wrong. I did not return to the old house. I knew Jared would send someone to watch the property. I anticipated the surveillance. I took a secondary taxi route, switching cars at a busy transit center before arriving at a towering glass skyscraper in the financial district. I rode the private elevator to the top floor. The reception area of Vance and Associates was designed to intimidate. It was a fortress of dark wood, brushed steel, and silent evaluating eyes. Bradley Vance did not intimidate me. We had crossed paths a decade ago during a massive federal embezzlement trial. He was a ruthless corporate attorney who defended the exact type of white-collar criminals I systematically investigated. We shared a mutual cold respect. Bradley sat behind a vast desk of polished slate. He looked at my heavily bandaged hands, then at the plain leather briefcase I placed on his desk. I did not offer pleasantries. I opened the briefcase. I slid the master patent and the licensing agreement across the slate surface. Bradley adjusted his heavy glasses. He read the first page. He read the second page. His posture shifted. The predatory boredom vanished from his eyes, replaced by sharp, focused attention. He read Esther's conditional operating license twice. He traced his finger over the revocation clause. He looked up at me. He recognized the sheer, uncompromising brilliance of the legal trap my late wife had constructed. Esther did not just give me a weapon. She gave me a fully operational guillotine. Bradley confirmed what I already knew. I was the absolute, uncontested owner of the algorithm. Jared's company was entirely reliant on an intellectual property he no longer had the right to use. Every contract he signed, every dollar he leveraged was now fundamentally fraudulent. The tech empire was nothing more than a phantom ownership. I did not ask Bradley to file a public lawsuit. A public lawsuit would give Jared time to maneuver. A public lawsuit would give him time to hide capital transfer, physical assets, and manipulate public relations. White-collar criminals thrive in the loud, messy arena of public litigation. I instructed Bradley to execute a silent adjustment. Jared relied on massive, continuous lines of credit to fund his server farms, his bloated executive payroll, and his lavish personal lifestyle. Those credit lines were secured entirely by the valuation of the predictive algorithm. Bradley drafted an emergency legal injunction. He submitted the authenticated master patent and the documentation of the revoked license directly to the central clearinghouses of Jared's primary lenders. The injunction did not seize the money. It simply notified the lenders that the collateral backing their multi-million-dollar loans no longer belonged to the borrower. Banks do not take risks with unsecured capital. The response was immediate and entirely invisible to the public eye. Algorithmic trading systems and risk management servers received the injunction. The lenders triggered automatic self-defense protocols. The corporate credit lines were frozen. The operational accounts were suspended. The corporate credit cards were instantly deactivated. The financial blood supply to Jared's empire was severed in less than 2 hours. No alarms sounded in his corporate headquarters. No police officers arrived with warrants. The adjustment was completely silent. Jared still believed he was a king, completely unaware that his kingdom was already a graveyard. He had tried to starve me by freezing my pension account. I was now starving his entire corporation. The starvation tactic was a two-way street, and I controlled the main artery. Megan did not understand the mechanics of corporate finance. She only understood the absolute power of spending it. She spent her afternoon at an exclusive European sports car dealership on the wealthy side of the city. She wanted to punish me for my defiance in the lobby earlier that morning. She believed the best way to prove her superiority was to purchase a $200,000 vehicle on a Tuesday afternoon. She sat in the VIP lounge of the dealership, drinking imported sparkling water while the sales manager prepared the final paperwork. She wore her arrogance like an impenetrable shield. She slid her heavy platinum corporate card across the glass table. She expected the usual fawning subservience. She expected the champagne toast that accompanied high-end acquisitions. The manager took the card to the back office. He returned 5 minutes later. He was not smiling. He did not offer her the keys to the new car. He placed the platinum card back on the glass table. He spoke with a strained, uncomfortable politeness. He informed Megan that the card had been declined. Megan laughed loudly. She assumed it was a simple fraud alert. She told him to run it again. She demanded he run it until it worked. The manager shook his head. He informed her that the issuing bank had placed a hard block on the account due to critical collateral failure. The other wealthy customers in the showroom turned to look. The humiliation was sudden, public, and absolute. Megan snatched the card from the table, her face flushed with a violent, ugly red. The facade of the untouchable elite shattered in an instant. She stormed out of the showroom, her heels hammering against the pristine floor. She climbed into her current luxury SUV and slammed the door. She dialed Jared's number. She did not wait for him to speak. She screamed into the phone. She demanded to know why she was being publicly embarrassed. She demanded money immediately. She demanded that he fix the problem before she returned home. The financial strangulation had begun, and the first casualty was her pride. She had tried to starve me out of my home. Now she was locked out of her own pristine reality. The silent adjustment was tightening its grip. The financial blockade erected by Bradley Vance was not a slow leak. It was a heavy steel door slamming shut on the neck of Jared's cash flow. Inside the sprawling executive suite of omniscient technologies, the atmosphere turned toxic within hours. The automated alerts began pinging relentlessly on Jared's multiple computer monitors. Operational accounts were frozen. Vendor credit lines were locked down, corporate platinum cards were systematically deactivated. But the legitimate banks were the least of his concerns. Jared had built his multi-million-dollar mansion, his luxury car collection, and his lavish lifestyle on a foundation of highly volatile, unregulated shadow debt. He had borrowed millions of dollars from private high-interest lenders who operated entirely outside the traditional banking system. These men did not care about software algorithms, intellectual property disputes, or venture capital valuations. They only cared about immediate liquidity and tangible collateral. When the primary corporate accounts seized up under Bradley's injunction, the automated weekly interest payments to these shadow lenders failed instantly. The phone calls to Jared's private mobile number shifted from polite inquiries to explicit, menacing threats. Megan's hysterical phone call from the car dealership was merely the ambient noise of a collapsing empire. Jared sat behind his massive desk, staring at the red error messages on his terminal, completely paralyzed by the sudden evaporation of his power. He was suffocating. He needed cash immediately. He needed hundreds of thousands of dollars just to keep the private lenders from arriving at his front door and tearing his life apart. Desperation is a highly predictable catalyst for catastrophic errors. White-collar criminals rarely surrender when they are cornered. They double down. They believe they can outsmart the consequences. Jared could not access the corporate trust. He could not sell his company shares because they were instantly flagged and paralyzed by the legal injunction. He needed a clean, unencumbered asset. He turned his attention to the only piece of property he believed was vulnerable. He targeted my modest wooden house. The house was fully paid off. It was a prime piece of real estate sitting on a rapidly appreciating lot. Jared knew I kept my financial records entirely analog, preferring locked filing cabinets and paper files over digital clouds. He assumed I was technologically blind to modern financial instruments. He logged into a secure online lending portal designed for rapid, high-risk equity loans. He filled out a comprehensive application for a massive second mortgage against my property. He used his intimate knowledge of my social security number, my tax history, and my personal details to bypass the initial security protocols. When the automated system required a verified signature to bind the contract, Jared did not hesitate. He used a sophisticated digital manipulation tool to extract and perfectly replicate my signature from an old scanned tax document. He applied the forged signature to the binding legal contract and submitted the loan. He committed federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft with the click of a mouse, completely convinced his digital tracks were invisible. I was sitting on my front porch holding a cup of black coffee when my phone illuminated with a very specific, high-priority notification. It was not a message from a commercial bank or a credit card company. It was an automated digital alert directly from the county clerk and recorder's office. I set my coffee mug down on the wooden railing. I opened the secure notification. The municipal database informed me that a substantial lien had just been initiated against the deed to my property. The loan application was currently moving through the rapid approval queue of a secondary market lender. I read the detailed logs of the digital signature verification. I did not feel shock. I did not feel outrage. I felt the grim, cold satisfaction of a hypothesis perfectly confirmed. I had anticipated this exact vulnerability for half a decade. 5 years ago, long before the tech startup and the venture capital millions, Jared exhibited a severe lack of impulse control. I discovered he had accumulated a massive underground gambling debt. He had secretly leveraged his early software contracts to pay off illegal sports bets and high-stakes poker games. I quietly stepped in and settled the immediate threat to protect his physical safety from the debt collectors, but I never trusted his moral compass again. I knew a gambling addict never truly cures their addiction to risk. They simply change the casino. I established the county clerk monitoring system the very next morning. I locked down the title to my home with municipal alerts that would notify me the exact second anyone attempted to borrow against my equity. Jared believed I was a relic of a forgotten era. He failed to understand that a forensic auditor views paranoia not as a weakness but as a standard operating procedure. I walked back inside the house and placed a secure call to Bradley Vance. The attorney answered on the first ring. I gave him the exact application number and the name of the secondary lender processing the fraudulent mortgage. Bradley accessed his secure terminal and pulled up the municipal filing. He read the loan amount and the digital signature verification logs. His reaction was a potent mixture of professional disgust and legal absolute certainty. He confirmed the massive scope of the crime. Jared had completely exposed himself to a mandatory minimum federal prison sentence. The forgery was explicit, meticulously documented, and currently moving across state lines via the digital portal. Bradley's voice crackled with the aggressive energy of a prosecutor who had just been handed a smoking gun. He instructed me to hang up the phone and dial the federal authorities immediately. He told me we needed to file an emergency injunction to stop the loan approval and dispatch law enforcement to Jared's corporate office before he could attempt to delete his server logs and cover his digital footprint. I listened to Bradley outline the swift, brutal legal response. I waited for him to finish his rapid tactical assessment. I looked out the living room window at the quiet street, watching the afternoon shadows slowly lengthen across the lawn. I told Bradley to stand down. I explicitly ordered him not to contact the authorities and not to block the loan application. Bradley was momentarily stunned into silence. He argued forcefully against my decision. He warned me that allowing the loan to process would place a massive legally binding encumbrance on my home. He stated that it was an entirely unnecessary and reckless risk. I corrected him with absolute calm. It was not a risk. It was the final trap. White-collar criminals are notoriously adept at claiming ignorance when they are caught in the preliminary planning stages of a fraud. They hire expensive, aggressive defense attorneys who argue that the fraudulent application was a mere clerical error, a misunderstanding, or a temporary lapse in judgment. They slip through the cracks of the justice system by claiming they never actually intended to complete the crime. I refused to leave Jared with any avenue of escape. A crime of this magnitude required undeniable, irreversible execution. I instructed Bradley to let the lender approve the funds. I wanted Jared to receive the stolen money. I wanted him to hold the physical proof of his federal crime in his corporate accounts. Once he accepted the wire transfer, the trap would spring shut permanently. The illusion of his success would become the exact instrument of his total destruction. Bradley understood the ruthless architecture of the plan. He agreed to monitor the wire transfer and wait for my command. Let him take the money, I said quietly into the phone. Let him build his own gallows. The digital confirmation arrived on a Thursday afternoon. The federal wire transfer cleared the secondary lending portal and deposited directly into a newly formed offshore holding account Jared had established to bypass Bradley's financial blockade. He stared at the glowing numbers on his screen. The stolen equity from my home amounted to exactly $1.5 million. A rational man under the crushing weight of shadow debt would have immediately transferred those funds to his illicit creditors to save his own life. The private lenders he owed were not patient men. They had already begun calling his personal phone at all hours of the night, leaving voicemails that contained explicit threats regarding his physical safety and the safety of his wife. Jared was not a rational man. He was a narcissist entirely addicted to the optics of success. He believed that perception dictated reality. If he could convince the city's top venture capitalists that his company was thriving, they would inject tens of millions in fresh capital. That new capital would allow him to quietly pay off the shadow lenders, secure his operational costs, and erase the temporary deficit. He firmly believed he was simply borrowing time. He immediately authorized the expenditure of $300,000 to secure the grand ballroom at the apex of the city's most exclusive hotel. He commissioned towering ice sculptures, imported rare orchids from overseas, and secured a Michelin-starred chef for a 5-course tasting menu. Megan's mood shifted the exact moment the funds were secured. The profound humiliation she suffered at the European car dealership was entirely forgotten, replaced by a renewed venomous arrogance. She spent hours coordinating with elite event planners, ensuring that every visual detail projected the illusion of an untouchable, infinitely wealthy tech empire. She demanded custom lighting and premium silk linens. She completely ignored the rotting foundation beneath her feet. The night of the investor gala was unseasonably warm. The grand ballroom was a cathedral of gold leaf and cascading crystal chandeliers. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos navigated through the dense crowd of industry titans, offering silver trays of beluga caviar and vintage champagne. The room buzzed with the frantic, high-stakes energy of people desperate to align themselves with the next major technological breakthrough. Jared stood near the center of the room, holding court among a circle of aging billionaires and aggressive hedge fund managers. He wore a custom velvet dinner jacket. His teeth flashed in a constant charismatic smile. He spoke loudly about scalability, machine learning, and predictive market dominance. Megan stood by his side, draped in heavy diamond necklaces she had leased specifically for the evening. She nodded in perfect synchronicity with her husband's lies, playing the role of the devoted visionary's wife. I knew the exact anatomy of this specific type of gathering. During my 3 decades as a forensic auditor, I had analyzed the expense reports of countless corporate galas designed to hide massive deficits. I understood that the lavishness of a corporate party was often directly proportional to the desperation of its host. The more a CEO spent on imported champagne, the closer his company was to absolute bankruptcy. Jared was attempting to build a bridge of smoke over a chasm of financial ruin. He was entirely unaware that I had spent the last 48 hours finalizing the destruction of his foundation. He thought he had outsmarted the system by forging my signature. He thought his crime was securely buried in digital paperwork. While Jared drank champagne, I stood in the quiet fitting room of Loretta's tailoring shop. She had worked tirelessly through the night to construct a garment that commanded absolute authority. The suit was cut from heavy, dark navy wool, tailored to fit my frame with uncompromising precision. It lacked the modern, flashy cut of Jared's expensive wardrobe. It was a suit built for a courtroom, for a hostile boardroom, for a corporate execution. Loretta smoothed the lapels with her experienced hands. She did not speak a word of pity. She simply nodded, recognizing the gravity of the moment. I looked down at my hands. The severe burns from the fireplace were slowly healing, but the skin remained raw, deeply scarred, and highly susceptible to infection. I wrapped them meticulously in fresh, brilliant white medical gauze. The bandages were stark and highly visible against the dark wool of my sleeves. They were no longer a symbol of my vulnerability or a mark of my victimization. They were a physical testament to the exact moment Jared chose his pride over my humanity. They were the undeniable evidence of the fire he permitted his wife to start. That fire was about to consume him entirely. I left the tailoring shop and stepped into the back of a black car waiting quietly by the curb. Bradley Vance sat in the adjacent seat. The ambient streetlights illuminated the sharp, predatory lines of his face. He held a thick, reinforced leather binder resting on his knees. Inside that binder was the authenticated master patent, the legally revoked licensing agreement, and a comprehensive certified ledger of the digital forgery Jared had committed to secure the illicit mortgage on my house. Bradley tapped his fingers rhythmically against the leather cover. He informed me that the federal authorities had reviewed the complete digital footprint of the loan application. The evidence was irrefutable. The IP addresses matched Jared's private server. The timestamp matched his location. The wire fraud crossed state lines, triggering immediate federal jurisdiction. We arrived at the rear security entrance of the luxury hotel. We did not walk through the main lobby to be announced. We utilized the secure service elevator, ascending silently toward the grand ballroom. When the metal doors parted on the top floor, 3 individuals in dark, unremarkable suits were waiting for us in the heavily carpeted hallway. They were senior investigators from the Federal Financial Crimes Division. They carried official badges clipped to their belts and sealed arrest warrants in their breast pockets. I did not greet them with a smile. I simply nodded. We moved down the hallway in a tight, synchronized, silent formation. Inside the ballroom, the ambient chatter began to quiet. A single spotlight cut through the dim lighting, illuminating the center stage. Jared approached the microphone to the sound of polite, expectant applause. He adjusted the microphone stand, projecting a flawless aura of humility and genius. He began his speech by speaking about the future of data architecture. He used complex technical terms he barely understood, memorized phrases designed to dazzle men with open checkbooks. He spoke about the sleepless nights he spent coding the foundational algorithm in a cramped, unheated apartment. He stole Esther's history. He stole her intellect. He claimed the quiet, solitary brilliance of my late wife as his own personal triumph. He raised his crystal glass, preparing to offer a toast to his own fabricated genius. He promised the assembled investors that Omniscient Technologies was standing on the precipice of a global monopoly. He promised them a future of unparalleled, exponential wealth. He smiled at the audience, entirely convinced of his own invincibility. He did not finish his sentence. The massive, heavy oak doors at the back of the grand ballroom did not simply open. They were pushed apart with a sudden, violent force that slammed the heavy brass handles against the interior walls. The sound echoed like a gunshot over the quiet crowd. The string quartet, positioned in the corner of the room, immediately stopped playing. The sudden silence was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. 500 wealthy investors turned simultaneously toward the entrance. I stepped over the threshold. I stood framed by the doorway, the brilliant white gauze on my hands catching the ambient spotlight. Bradley Vance stood firmly to my right. The 3 federal auditors stood to my left, their postures rigid and uncompromising. I locked my eyes directly onto my son. 500 pairs of eyes shifted from the brightly lit stage to the back of the room. The absolute silence was heavier than the humid night air pressing against the hotel windows. I did not break my gaze from my son. I walked forward, and the sea of venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, and tech elites naturally parted to make way. They did not know who I was, but they instantly recognized the gravity of the men flanking me. The 3 federal auditors moved with a rigid, synchronized discipline that radiated law enforcement authority. Bradley Vance walked with the predatory confidence of a corporate assassin carrying a stack of thick, reinforced leather binders. My custom-tailored dark navy wool suit felt like heavy armor against the ambient warmth of the room. The brilliant white medical gauze wrapped tightly around my hands glowed under the cascading crystal chandeliers. Every step I took toward the stage was a physical manifestation of 30 years spent dismantling corporate greed. I remembered the hundreds of hostile boardrooms I had entered throughout my career to strip arrogant men of their stolen wealth. This grand ballroom was no different. The only variation was that the criminal standing on the precipice of absolute ruin shared my last name. Jared stood perfectly still behind the microphone stand. The charismatic, invincible smile he had worn seconds earlier had completely evaporated. His face was a mask of pale, sickening dread. He looked at the federal agents. He looked at Bradley's leather binders. He looked at my bandaged hands. I watched his eyes track the evidence of his own destruction. He realized his starvation tactic had failed. He realized the forged mortgage was not a buried secret. I climbed the short carpeted staircase to the stage. Jared did not try to stop me. He stepped backward, shrinking away from the microphone as if the metal stand were suddenly electrified. I took his place at the center of the stage. I adjusted the microphone with my wrapped hands. The subtle friction of the medical gauze against the metal amplified through the massive sound system, echoing over the frozen crowd. I did not yell. I did not let a single ounce of anger or betrayal bleed into my voice. Anger is undisciplined and reckless. I spoke with the terrifying, absolute calm of a man who held every single card in the deck. I introduced myself to the silent ballroom. I told them my name was Harlan Cole. I told them I was a retired federal forensic auditor, the sole executor of the Esther Cole estate, and the absolute legal owner of the predictive data algorithm currently powering Omniscient Technologies. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd, a sudden low wave of confusion and rising alarm. Jared opened his mouth to protest, to shout for the hotel security team, but a sharp, authoritative look from the lead federal auditor froze the words in his throat. I raised my bandaged right hand, gesturing toward the floor. Bradley Vance and the 3 auditors immediately moved into the crowd. They did not hand documents to everyone. They moved with surgical precision, specifically targeting the alpha investors, the lead venture capitalists, and the primary board members sitting at the VIP tables nearest to the stage. They distributed the thick black leather folders with mechanical efficiency. I spoke directly into the microphone, guiding the wealthy elite through the paperwork that was about to erase their investments. I instructed them to open the folders. I told them to look at the first document. It was a certified, authenticated copy of the master patent. I explained that Esther Cole, my late wife, engineered the core architecture in the quiet solitude of our basement. I explained that she never surrendered ownership to Jared or his corporate entity. She possessed a brilliant defensive intellect. She merely granted his company an exclusive conditional operating license. I watched the faces of the billionaires as they read the highlighted revocation clause. I watched their eyes widen in sudden comprehension as they realized the foundational asset of the entire company was entirely contingent upon Jared maintaining a strict moral and fiduciary duty to me. I did not let them recover from the initial shock. I instructed the investors to turn to the second document in the folder. I explained that Jared recently found himself drowning in unregulated shadow debt to fund his extravagant lifestyle and his wife's endless demands. I detailed how he attempted to force me out of my home, freezing my pension account to starve me into compliance. I told the room that when his extortion failed, he resorted to federal wire fraud to maintain his illusion of wealth. The document they were holding was a certified log from the county clerk and a secondary lending portal. It contained the undeniable digital footprint of Jared forging my signature to extract a $1.5 million illicit mortgage against my private property. I pointed to the three men standing in the crowd. I informed the investors that they were senior investigators from the Federal Financial Crimes Division. They were not there to enjoy the caviar. They were there to verify the exact scope of the wire fraud and identity theft currently crossing state lines into Jared's offshore holding accounts. The reaction in the ballroom was instantaneous and catastrophic. The illusion of the untouchable tech empire shattered into a million pieces of worthless data. The venture capitalists who had been smiling and drinking vintage champagne moments ago abruptly stood up from their tables. They realized they were preparing to inject tens of millions of dollars into a corporate shell that possessed zero intellectual property and was actively managed by a man facing a mandatory minimum federal prison sentence. A prominent hedge fund manager threw his leather folder onto the table and pulled out his cell phone, shouting frantic orders to his risk management team to freeze all pending wire transfers. Another lead investor physically grabbed the lucrative term sheet he had signed earlier that evening and tore it in half, letting the pieces fall to the floor. The panic spread through the grand ballroom like a contagion. The company valuation was not simply dropping. It was plummeting to absolute zero in real time. Omniscient Technologies was officially toxic. The wealthy elite scrambled toward the massive oak doors, desperate to distance themselves from the blast radius of an active federal investigation. Megan stood near the edge of the stage. The least diamond necklaces sparkled against her skin, but she looked completely hollowed out. She watched the billionaires flee toward the exits. She watched the venture capital evaporate into the night air. She looked at Jared with a mixture of absolute disgust and profound terror. She realized the European sports cars, the multi-million-dollar smart home, and the lavish societal status she craved were all permanently gone. She slowly backed away from the stage, slipping into the chaotic, surging crowd, abandoning her husband to the authorities without a single backward glance. Jared was left entirely alone under the harsh spotlight. His breathing was shallow and rapid. The reality of his complete destruction finally crushed the air out of his lungs. The arrogance he had worn like a crown was violently stripped away, leaving behind a terrified, fraudulent little boy who had been caught stealing. His legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto the polished wooden floor of the stage. He fell to his knees directly in front of my shoes. He reached out with trembling hands, grasping the dark wool fabric of my suit trousers. He looked up at me, his face slick with sweat and tears. He begged for mercy. He pleaded with me to tell the federal agents it was a massive misunderstanding. He swore he would pay back the forged mortgage. He swore he would give me a seat on his board, a new house, whatever I wanted. He sobbed, claiming he was my only son and that I could not possibly send my own flesh and blood to a concrete cell. I looked down at his tear-stained face. I felt absolutely no anger. I felt no pity. I felt the exact same cold surgical detachment I reserved for the corporate criminals I audited for 3 decades. I looked at the sterile white gauze wrapping my hands. I remembered the smell of his mother's quilt burning in his fireplace while he stood by in cowardice and allowed the disrespect to happen. I remembered the cold text message ordering me out of the home I built with Esther. You triggered the revocation clause the exact moment you put your greed above my humanity, I said softly, ensuring the stage microphone caught every single syllable of his termination. The operating license is permanently revoked. You own absolutely nothing. I pulled my leg back, forcing his grasping hands off my suit. I am the sole proprietor of this algorithm, and as of this exact second, you are officially fired from my company. I turned my back on my son. I walked out of the grand ballroom, leaving him kneeling on the polished hardwood stage. Bradley Vance and the federal auditors followed me into the warm night air. The execution was complete. The fallout, however, was just beginning. By midnight, the financial presses had the story. The digital articles hit the global internet with brutal algorithmic efficiency. The headlines stripped away years of carefully curated public relations. Omniscient Technologies was exposed not as a revolutionary data firm, but as a hollow corporate shell built on revoked intellectual property and massive, unregulated debt. The valuation graphs on the global market trackers plummeted from $1 billion to a flat, unforgiving zero line in a matter of minutes. The legitimate venture capitalists immediately issued press releases distancing themselves from the toxic asset. The shadow lenders Jared had borrowed from did not read the Financial Times, but they maintained their own rapid intelligence networks. When the news of the federal investigation and the frozen accounts hit their channels, they mobilized. They dispatched aggressive collection teams to the multi-million-dollar mansion situated in the exclusive gated community. Legitimate repossession agents from the European car dealerships arrived simultaneously. The property became a besieged fortress of unpaid debts. Megan had fled the hotel ballroom long before Jared fell to his knees. She drove her luxury SUV recklessly through the city, breaking speed limits to reach the mansion before the collapse became absolute. She rushed through the heavy mahogany front doors and immediately opened her laptop on the marble kitchen island. She logged into her private offshore banking portals, her hands shaking violently over the keyboard. She prayed that Jared had siphoned some fraction of the illicit mortgage funds into an emergency account she could control. She typed her passwords and stared at the high-resolution screens. The balances read 0. The primary accounts were locked by the bank. The secondary accounts were frozen by federal mandate. The realization hit her with the crushing weight of physical gravity. The phantom wealth was completely gone. She was married to a man who possessed nothing but massive criminal liability. Panic is a primitive overriding instinct. Megan did not pause to mourn her marriage or the sudden loss of her societal status. She sprinted up the floating glass staircase to the master suite. She threw open the doors of her massive custom-built walk-in closet. She dragged 4 oversized designer leather suitcases onto the center of the pristine carpet. She began ripping clothes from the hangers. She ignored the professional business attire and the standard casual wear. She targeted only the high-value, easily liquidated items. She stuffed custom silk dresses, rare vintage handbags, and unboxed designer shoes into the leather luggage. She moved to the vanity and swept her collection of expensive cosmetics, luxury watches, and loose gold jewelry into a heavy silk pouch. She intended to load her car, drive across the state line, and disappear completely before the federal agents froze her personal physical assets. She dragged the heavy suitcases down the stairs. The metal wheels violently scratched the polished glass steps and the imported stone floors of the foyer. She did not care about the extensive property damage. She only cared about a rapid escape. She reached the massive entryway just as the heavy front doors opened. Jared walked into the house. He looked like a reanimated corpse. His custom velvet dinner jacket was deeply wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. His expensive silk tie was pulled loose and hung crookedly around his neck. The charismatic glow that had defined his public persona for 4 years was entirely extinguished. He moved with the slow, unsteady, mechanical gait of a man who had just watched his own execution. He looked at the leather luggage clustered haphazardly by the front door. He looked at his wife standing rigid with a silk pouch clutched tightly in her manicured hands. The silence in the massive vaulted foyer was absolute and heavy. The facade of their perfect, highly curated marriage shattered completely. The confrontation did not begin with a discussion or a plea for understanding. It began with an explosion of pure, venomous rage. Megan screamed at him. Her voice echoed off the high ceilings, harsh, shrill, and devoid of any lingering affection. She called him a stupid, incompetent fraud. She screamed that she had married a visionary tech genius, not a pathetic, desperate thief who had to forge his own father's signature just to survive another week. She blamed his arrogance and his monumental stupidity for destroying their perfect lives. She grabbed a heavy silver vase from the entryway table and hurled it across the room. It shattered violently against the pristine white wall, sending water and expensive imported orchids scattering across the polished stone floor. Jared did not flinch from the shattering silver. The insult ignited a dark, ugly fury within his exhausted mind. He screamed back, his voice hoarse and raw. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at the designer luggage in the silk pouch. He blamed her insatiable, endless greed for the entire financial collapse. He roared that he had to borrow millions of dollars from violent, unregulated shadow lenders just to keep her draped in leased diamonds and imported European sports cars. He screamed that her constant, unrelenting demand for a flawless, wealthy aesthetic had forced him into a corner, pushing him to take the second mortgage. He told her she was a parasite who had systematically drained his accounts and driven him to commit a major federal crime. The fight turned vicious and primal. They circled each other in the grand foyer, shouting horrific, deeply personal insults that could never be unsaid. They stripped away years of polite society manners, reducing themselves to cornered animals fighting over the worthless scraps of a ruined kingdom. Jared grabbed the handle of the largest leather suitcase and violently hurled it down the hallway. The heavy impact burst the zipper, sending expensive silk clothes and designer shoes spilling over the tiles. Megan shrieked in absolute fury and stepped forward, slapping him across the face with all her strength. She yelled that she was leaving him immediately to rot in a federal cell. Jared laughed a harsh, broken, breathless laugh. He told her she was equally complicit, that her signature was on the joint tax returns, and that the federal auditors would relentlessly strip her of every single asset she attempted to hide. The screaming match reached a fever pitch. Their voices bounced violently off the cold marble walls, drowning out any other sound. They were so consumed by their mutual hatred and total despair that they did not hear the heavy tactical vehicles tearing up the long manicured driveway. They did not hear the screech of heavy tires stopping violently on the cobblestone motor court outside. The first indication that the outside world had finally breached their isolated fortress was the sudden dramatic shift in the ambient light. Intense rhythmic flashes of red and blue light swept through the towering front windows, casting long, frantic shadows across the vaulted ceiling and the scattered designer clothes. The flashing lights painted their pale, furious faces in harsh, alternating colors. Heavy fists began pounding relentlessly against the thick mahogany front doors, shaking the heavy wood in its frame. A deep, authoritative voice, amplified by a police megaphone, boomed through the quiet, affluent neighborhood, ordering Jared to open the door immediately and step outside with his hands visible. The federal agents and the local police tactical units had arrived. They carried the signed federal arrest warrants for wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. The screaming instantly stopped. Megan dropped her silk pouch. The heavy gold jewelry spilled onto the stone floor with a dull, heavy clatter. Jared stared blindly at the flashing red and blue lights, his breathing completely stopped. The heavy tactical boots of the federal agents shattered the remaining silence of the grand foyer. Jared offered no resistance. He stood paralyzed as the cold steel handcuffs were ratcheted tightly around his wrists. The metallic click echoed sharply against the towering marble walls. The arresting officers read him his Miranda rights in a flat clinical drone, hauling his limp body toward the flashing red and blue lights of the waiting cruisers. Megan did not rush to his side. She did not scream for an attorney. She executed a flawless, instantaneous pivot. When a senior federal financial crimes investigator approached her with a notepad, she collapsed against the entryway table. She buried her face in her manicured hands and unleashed a torrent of manufactured hysterical tears. She swore she was merely a naive housewife. She claimed absolute total ignorance of Jared's corporate finances, his shadow debts, and the forged mortgage on my property. She played the role of the terrified, betrayed spouse with award-winning precision. White-collar investigations prioritize the primary target. The agents secured the perimeter, confiscated Jared's personal electronics, and left Megan standing alone in the ruined hallway. They explicitly advised her not to leave the state. They did not arrest her. Megan waited exactly 5 minutes after the last federal cruiser exited the gated community. She wiped the fake tears from her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. The paralyzing fear morphed into a cold, hyper-focused survival instinct. She understood that Jared was a sinking ship, and she had absolutely no intention of drowning in his wake. She also understood the brutal reality of her financial situation. The corporate accounts were frozen, her personal credit lines were dead, the violent shadow lenders were still circling the property. She needed an immediate massive influx of capital to maintain her existence and fund her escape. There was only one man left who controlled the wealth she required. She abandoned the spilled designer luggage in the foyer. She grabbed her keys and walked out to her luxury SUV. The drive across the city took 40 minutes. She navigated away from the pristine manicured lawns of the elite suburbs and entered my modest working-class neighborhood. I was sitting on my front porch. I had not gone to sleep. I wore a heavy wool sweater against the night chill, drinking a cup of black coffee. I anticipated her arrival. Parasites always seek out a new host when their primary food source expires. The heavy tires of her vehicle crunched against the gravel of my driveway. She stepped out of the car, adjusting her posture and fixing her expression before she even reached the concrete path. She walked up the wooden steps of my porch. The ambient glow of the street lamp illuminated her pale face. She immediately activated her performance. Her eyes filled with fresh tears. Her voice trembled perfectly as she called my name in the dark. She collapsed onto the wooden bench opposite my chair, burying her face in her hands once more. She launched into a frantic, sobbing monologue. She told me Jared was a monster. She claimed he had manipulated her, lied to her, and forced her to participate in his lavish lifestyle under the constant threat of emotional abuse. She painted herself as a fellow victim of his towering narcissism. She begged for my forgiveness. She begged for my understanding. She pleaded with me to see her as an innocent bystander caught in the crossfire of his massive federal crimes. I sat perfectly still. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not offer her a word of comfort. I simply watched her perform. My silence was a vacuum, and narcissists despise vacuums. They need a reaction to gauge the success of their manipulation. When I provided nothing, Megan's tears abruptly stopped. Her posture straightened. The trembling vulnerability vanished, replaced by the sharp, calculating edge of a cornered predator. The transition was seamless and terrifying. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. She dropped the victim narrative entirely and proposed a demonic, highly calculated transaction. She reminded me that federal wire fraud cases can be notoriously complex to prosecute. She reminded me that high-priced defense attorneys can drag trials out for years, obfuscating the truth, hiding digital evidence, and wearing down prosecutors. She then reminded me of the powerful legal concept of spousal privilege. A wife cannot be compelled to testify against her husband in a federal court. However, she offered to voluntarily waive that privilege. She offered to become the federal prosecutor's absolute star witness. She promised to hand them the digital keys to Jared's private encrypted servers. She promised to testify under oath in open court that she physically witnessed him forging my signature on the mortgage documents. She guaranteed his absolute inescapable conviction. She offered me the complete, undeniable destruction of my own son. She did not offer this weapon out of a sense of moral justice or familial duty. She named her price. She demanded the physical deed to the multi-million-dollar mansion free and clear of all shadow encumbrances. She demanded a massive permanent monthly payout drawn directly from the newly secured algorithm licensing fees. She demanded I fund her elite lifestyle indefinitely in exchange for locking my son in a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. I looked at the woman sitting on my porch. I looked at her pristine blonde hair and her tailored designer clothes. I did not see a shrewd negotiator. I saw the culmination of decades of systemic arrogance. I thought of Esther. My late wife was a brilliant, pioneering software engineer who built the foundation of a technological empire. She was also a woman of color who navigated a tech industry dominated by aggressive, privileged white men. She fought a quiet, relentless war for every ounce of respect she ever received. Megan had spent the entirety of her marriage to Jared launching relentless, suffocating microaggressions at Esther. I remembered the excruciating family dinners. I remembered Megan complimenting Esther's cooking while expressing loud theatrical shock that someone from Esther's specific cultural background could understand complex, refined flavor profiles. I remembered Megan casually dismissing Esther's technical patents as lucky accidents, or whispering that she only secured corporate funding because of diversity quotas. Megan had wielded her race and her upper-class upbringing as invisible weapons, constantly attempting to remind Esther of her supposed social inferiority. She had smiled with perfect white teeth while she systematically degraded the smartest, most dignified woman I ever knew. Megan sat on my porch, utterly convinced that her privilege shielded her from any real consequence. She believed she could negotiate with me as an equal. She believed I would eagerly pay her millions of dollars to secure Jared's downfall. She assumed my desire for vengeance against my son outweighed my profound, enduring disgust for her. She assumed I was a bitter, angry old man desperate for a guaranteed courtroom victory. I placed my coffee mug on the small wooden table. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue the legal merits of her extortion attempt. I simply reached into the pocket of my wool sweater and retrieved my smartphone. I tapped the screen once to wake it up. The bright digital display illuminated the dark space between us. I turned the phone around so she could clearly see the interface. The red recording indicator had been pulsing steadily for the last 20 minutes. I had activated the application the exact moment her luxury tires hit my gravel driveway. Megan stared at the screen. The calculating sharpness in her eyes shattered, replaced by a sudden, total paralyzing horror. The color completely drained from her face. She realized the sheer magnitude of her error. She had just detailed a comprehensive criminal extortion plot. She had explicitly offered to sell federal testimony in exchange for real estate and cash. She had willingly confessed to possessing intimate first-hand knowledge of Jared's digital crimes, directly contradicting the sworn statement of ignorance she had given the federal agents less than 2 hours prior. She had walked onto my porch to sell my son, and she had inadvertently handed me the rope to hang her right beside him. I did not give her time to beg. I did not give her time to formulate a defense or attempt to snatch the device from my heavily bandaged hands. I maintained unbroken eye contact with her as my thumb hovered over the screen. I tapped the stop button. I tapped the share icon. I selected the secure direct contact file for Bradley Vance, which automatically copied the district attorney handling the newly minted federal case. I pressed send. The digital progress bar filled instantly. The audio file was gone, hurtling through cyberspace directly into the hands of federal prosecutors. The extortion attempt was now a matter of permanent legal record. Megan's attempt to play the innocent victim was completely and permanently destroyed. The federal agents would not be so polite during their second interview. They would arrive with handcuffs and felony conspiracy charges. I lowered the phone and looked at her in the quiet night. I told her the authorities would be actively looking for her before sunrise. I told her she had exactly 0 leverage left. I suggested she start running. Megan did not say another word. The primal fear took complete control of her nervous system. She scrambled backward off the wooden bench, stumbling wildly over her own expensive shoes. She practically crawled down the porch steps, scraping her knees against the concrete path. She sprinted toward her luxury SUV, her breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. She tore open the driver's side door, threw herself behind the steering wheel, and slammed the vehicle into reverse. The tires spun violently in the gravel, throwing rocks against the side of my house. She sped out of the neighborhood, fleeing into the dark, entirely consumed by the terror of her impending incarceration. I sat alone on the quiet porch. The night air was cool and still. I picked up my coffee mug and took another slow, deliberate sip. The silent adjustment was nearing its final, absolute conclusion. I sat on the quiet porch long after the taillights of Megan's luxury SUV disappeared into the darkness. The gravel driveway was scarred by her frantic retreat. The night remained perfectly still. I finished the last cold drop of my coffee. The first phase of the corporate execution was flawlessly executed, but a forensic auditor knows that a cornered animal is most dangerous in the final moments of its captivity. I knew Jared would not simply surrender to a federal indictment. He would fight. He would claw at the walls of his collapsing reality. He would search for a singular, desperate loophole to invalidate his destruction. The confirmation of his counterattack arrived exactly 36 hours later. Jared did not remain in federal custody for long. White-collar criminals of his specific breed always possess a hidden contingency plan. A sympathetic venture capitalist or a heavily leveraged silent partner posted his exorbitant bail. They did not post his bail out of loyalty or familial love. They posted it because a CEO sitting in a federal holding cell cannot maneuver corporate assets or sign non-disclosure agreements. They needed him on the outside to mitigate their own massive financial exposure. Jared was released into the humid city air with an ankle monitor and a suspended passport. He was stripped of his company, stripped of his dignity, and facing decades in prison. He had absolutely nothing left to lose. That made him exceptionally dangerous. The heavy knock on my front door came precisely at 8 in the morning. I was standing in the kitchen, carefully wrapping fresh medical gauze around my healing hands. I did not expect a friendly neighborhood visit. I opened the heavy wooden door to find a man in a cheap beige suit holding a thick stack of manila folders. He did not smile. He asked for Harlan Cole. I confirmed my identity. He thrust the heavy stack of folders against my chest. He announced that I had been officially served. I carried the heavy legal documents to the kitchen table. I did not call Bradley Vance immediately. I read every single page with the meticulous, detached scrutiny of a career investigator. Jared had not filed a motion in a corporate litigation court. He knew he could not defeat Bradley Vance in a battle over intellectual property law. The evidence of the forged mortgage and the revoked algorithm license was mathematically absolute. Instead, Jared executed a lateral maneuver. He filed an emergency injunction in the municipal family court. The legal filing was a masterpiece of manufactured victimhood and psychological manipulation. Jared was petitioning the court to grant him full immediate conservatorship over my person and my estate. The documents claimed that I was suffering from severe, rapidly progressing dementia. The narrative woven throughout the legal brief was insidious. It painted me as a grieving, confused widower who had violently lost his grip on reality following the death of his wife. Jared claimed that my recent actions, the sudden corporate hostility, the freezing of his credit lines, and the revocation of the foundational algorithm were not the calculated decisions of a rational man. He claimed they were the erratic, destructive outbursts of a diseased mind. He needed physical evidence to support his extreme allegations. He needed undeniable proof that I was a danger to myself and incapable of managing my own affairs. He found that proof in the exact injury he had caused. The legal filing contained high-resolution photographs taken by the private investigator Jared had hired to follow me. The photographs clearly showed my heavily bandaged hands. The accompanying medical affidavit signed by a highly paid, unethical concierge doctor who had never actually examined me stated that the burns were a clear indicator of self-harm. Jared submitted a sworn declaration detailing the night of the housewarming party. He testified under penalty of perjury that I had suffered a psychotic break. He claimed I had violently plunged my bare hands into a roaring fireplace in a state of senile delusion. He entirely omitted the fact that I was reaching into the flames to rescue his mother's irreplaceable handmade quilt from his own malicious destruction. He twisted his act of supreme disrespect into a weapon of legal incapacitation. I picked up my phone and dialed Bradley. I read the core allegations aloud. Bradley's voice turned dangerously sharp. He recognized the brutal efficiency of the strategy. If the family court judge declared me legally incompetent, every single document I had signed in the last month would be instantly invalidated. The revocation of the algorithm license would be nullified. The corporate takeover would be reversed. Jared would be granted absolute legal authority to drop the federal fraud charges, unfreeze the company accounts, and reclaim the entire technological empire. The competency trap was his final desperate bid for survival. We arrived at the municipal courthouse early the next morning. The family court building was an imposing structure of gray concrete and heavy bronze doors. It was a place designed to handle the messy, emotional collapse of human relationships. We walked into the assigned courtroom. Jared was already seated at the petitioner's table. He wore a conservative gray suit. He looked exhausted, but a manic, predatory energy radiated from his posture. He had hired a ruthless, highly aggressive family law attorney who specialized in hostile conservatorships. Jared did not look at me. He stared intently at the judge's empty bench. He believed he had found the perfect legal mechanism to erase his crimes. The judge entered the courtroom and convened the emergency hearing. The proceedings were swift and deeply unsettling. Jared's attorney stood up and delivered a theatrical, impassioned opening statement. He did not speak about corporate finance or forged mortgages. He spoke entirely about tragedy and mental decline. He pointed directly at me. He pointed at the stark white medical gauze wrapping my hands. He argued that the physical evidence of self-harm was indisputable. He stated that a man who willingly burns his own flesh cannot be trusted to navigate complex multi-million-dollar intellectual property disputes. He argued that Jared was a loving, desperately concerned son trying to save his father from a catastrophic mental breakdown. He completely inverted the reality of the situation. He transformed the predator into a grieving savior and the victim into an unstable threat. The attorney formally requested an immediate mandatory freeze on all my physical and financial assets. He requested that the court invalidate the algorithm transfer until a comprehensive medical evaluation could be completed. Bradley Vance stood up to counter the motion. He argued with surgical precision. He presented the federal indictments. He presented the undeniable proof of Jared's massive wire fraud. He stated that this entire family court proceeding was a transparent, cynical tactic designed to stall a legitimate federal criminal investigation. Bradley argued that my actions were not erratic, but flawlessly calculated and legally sound. The judge listened to both sides. Family court judges operate under a very specific, highly protective mandate. When presented with physical evidence of severe injury and sworn affidavits alleging immediate mental decline, their primary directive is to err on the side of extreme caution. The burden of proof for a temporary emergency injunction is notoriously low. The judge looked at my bandaged hands. He looked at the medical affidavit submitted by Jared's doctor. He did not look at the federal wire fraud documents. The physical burns superseded the financial crimes in the hierarchy of immediate municipal concern. The judge struck his gavel against the wooden block. The sound echoed with heavy final authority. He announced his ruling. He stated that the severity of the physical injuries and the extreme nature of the corporate dispute warranted a temporary pause. He officially granted the emergency injunction. He ordered an immediate mandatory freeze on all my assets. He legally suspended the revocation of the algorithm license pending further review. He then ordered me to surrender myself to a state-appointed psychiatric facility within 48 hours. I was mandated to undergo a comprehensive multi-day cognitive evaluation to determine my absolute legal competency. I looked across the aisle. Jared turned his head and looked directly at me. The exhaustion vanished from his face. A slow, triumphant, venomous smile spread across his features. He believed he had won. He believed the state had just handed him the keys to his empire. He believed he could manipulate the psychiatric evaluation just as easily as he manipulated his investors. He believed the old man was finally trapped. He thought he had outsmarted the forensic auditor. He thought my silence in the courtroom was the silence of defeat. He was completely, fundamentally wrong. The psychiatric evaluation was not a trap. It was the exact arena I needed to secure his absolute destruction. The state-appointed psychiatric facility was designed to strip individuals of their autonomy before a single question was even asked. The walls were painted a sterile institutional green. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, oppressive frequency. The chairs were bolted to the linoleum floor. It was an environment constructed to make the subject feel small, vulnerable, and entirely dependent on the medical authority sitting across the metal table. I walked into the evaluation room and took my seat. I did not slouch. I did not fidget. I sat with the rigid, upright posture of a man about to conduct a federal audit. I placed my heavy leather briefcase on the table, resting my bandaged hands gently on top of the worn leather. Dr. Eris Thorne entered the room exactly 3 minutes later. She carried a thick file containing Jared's fabricated allegations and the fraudulent medical affidavits. She was a senior forensic psychiatrist, a woman who had spent decades analyzing the decaying minds of the elderly. Her eyes were sharp, evaluating, and deeply skeptical. She sat across from me and opened her folder. She expected a defensive, confused old man. She expected me to raise my voice to deny my son's accusations with the frantic, uncoordinated energy of a dementia patient losing their grip on reality. I offered her absolute silence. She began with the standard cognitive baselines. She asked me to state my full name, my date of birth, and my current address. She asked me to name the current president and to count backward from 100 by intervals of 7. I answered her questions with flat, mechanical precision. I did not stumble. I did not hesitate. I projected a terrifying, unblinking lucidity. Dr. Thorne noted my responses, her pen scratching rhythmically against her legal pad. The baseline tests were merely the prologue. She turned the page of her file, arriving at the core of Jared's legal trap. She looked directly at my hands. She asked me to explain the severe burns wrapping my knuckles. She read from Jared's sworn affidavit reciting his claim that I had suffered a violent psychotic break and plunged my bare hands into a roaring fire in a state of senile delusion. She asked me why a sane man would willingly destroy his own flesh. I did not avert my gaze. I looked into her evaluating eyes and delivered the absolute truth. I explained the historical and emotional significance of Esther's handmade quilt. I detailed Jared's malicious decision to throw that irreplaceable artifact into the flames simply because I refused to surrender my financial autonomy to him. I told her I reached into the fire because the preservation of my late wife's legacy was fundamentally more valuable than the temporary integrity of my epidermal tissue. I did not stop at the emotional justification. I transitioned immediately into the medical aftermath. A man suffering from advanced dementia does not possess the executive function to manage a severe physical trauma. I systematically dismantled Jared's narrative of a confused, helpless victim. I recited the exact chemical composition of the silver sulfadiazine ointment I applied to the burns within 3 minutes of the incident. I detailed the precise cellular regeneration timeline I was currently managing. I explained my strict adherence to a sterile redressing protocol to mitigate the risk of systemic infection. I spoke with the clinical detached vocabulary of a chief medical officer. Dr. Thorne stopped writing. The skepticism in her eyes began to fracture. She was listening to a man who possessed a higher degree of cognitive organization than the attorneys who had filed the injunction against him. The time for defense was over. It was time to initiate the offensive. I unclasped the brass locks of my leather briefcase. I explained to Dr. Thorne that severe cognitive decline is almost universally characterized by a total loss of financial executive function. Dementia patients misplace funds, fall victim to predatory scams, and fail to comprehend complex economic structures. I told her I was going to demonstrate my financial competency by thoroughly auditing the man who had accused me of losing my mind. I withdrew the first stack of documents and laid them flat on the metal table. They were the comprehensive ledgers of Jared's underground gambling debts. I explained the exact chronological progression of his addiction, detailing how he leveraged his early venture capital to cover catastrophic losses in unregulated offshore sports books. I pointed to the specific dates and the corresponding wire transfers, reciting the alphanumeric routing numbers entirely from memory. I watched Dr. Thorne's eyes scan the staggering financial deficits. I withdrew the second stack of documents. These were the digital logs I had pulled from the county clerk's monitoring system. I laid the evidence of the forged mortgage directly in front of her. I did not generalize the crime. I explained the exact mechanics of the digital forgery. I detailed the specific software Jared utilized to extract my signature from a 5-year-old tax return. I recited the IP addresses that traced the fraudulent application directly back to his private corporate server. I explained the timeline of the federal wire transfer clearing the secondary lending portal and depositing into his offshore holding account. I presented a flawless, irrefutable narrative of high-level corporate fraud. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the edge of the table. I explained the concept of DARVO to the senior psychiatrist. Deny attack and reverse victim and offender. I told her that Jared was currently drowning in millions of dollars of shadow debt. I explained that my refusal to surrender my intellectual property had severed his access to legitimate capital. The family court injunction was not an act of love. It was an act of extreme financial desperation. He was attempting to weaponize the municipal psychiatric system to legally incapacitate the only man holding the evidence of his federal crimes. I told her that she was not conducting a medical evaluation. She was being utilized as an unwitting accomplice in a multi-million-dollar extortion plot. Dr. Thorne sat in profound silence. She looked at the gambling ledgers. She looked at the digital forgery logs. She looked at the man sitting across from her who had just recited hundreds of data points, dates, and financial routing numbers without referencing a single note. She possessed decades of clinical experience. She knew exactly what dementia looked like. It looked like confusion. It looked like fear. It looked like a desperate grasping at fading memories. The man sitting in front of her was operating with the terrifying razor-sharp efficiency of a supercomputer. She decided to test the absolute limits of my recall. She closed her file and asked me to describe a specific federal audit I had conducted 30 years ago. I did not hesitate. I recounted the entire architecture of a massive corporate embezzlement case from a decade before Jared was even born. I named the dummy corporations. I detailed the exact percentages of the laundered funds. I recited the names of the prosecuting attorneys and the final sentencing mandates. I spoke for 10 unbroken minutes, painting a flawless, deeply detailed portrait of a financial investigation that had been buried in federal archives for decades. Dr. Thorne raised her hand, signaling me to stop. She did not need to hear another word. She reached for the heavy file Jared's attorneys had provided. She closed it with a sharp, definitive snap and pushed it to the far corner of the metal table. She opened a secondary drawer and retrieved an official state document bearing the seal of the Municipal Health Department. It was the absolute certificate of mental competency. She picked up her pen. She did not hesitate. She signed her name across the bottom line, applying her official medical stamp. She handed the document across the table. She informed me that I was operating at a cognitive level that surpassed the majority of the medical staff in the facility. She legally dismantled Jared's family court injunction with a single stroke of ink. My assets were immediately unfrozen. The revocation of the algorithm license was permanently validated. But Dr. Eris Thorne was not finished. She was a mandated reporter for the state, legally obligated to act when presented with undeniable evidence of elder abuse. She reached into her drawer a second time. She pulled out a stark red folder. She opened a multi-page incident report designed specifically for the state prosecutor's office. She looked at the forged mortgage documents. She looked at my burned, bandaged hands. She began to fill out the form with rapid, furious keystrokes on her terminal. She did not just clear my name. She initiated a devastating secondary strike against my son. She officially charged Jared with severe, malicious elder abuse. She classified the forged mortgage as a violent act of financial exploitation against a vulnerable senior citizen. She explicitly documented his attempt to manipulate the medical and legal systems to facilitate a federal crime. She printed the official report and signed it with aggressive force. She looked across the table at me, handing me a copy of the criminal referral. She informed me that the local district attorney would have the abuse charges on their desk within the hour. The state was no longer evaluating my sanity. The state was now actively hunting my son. I placed the documents into my leather briefcase and snapped the brass lock shut. I stood up from the metal table, the sterile fluorescent lights reflecting off the flawless white gauze on my hands. The competency trap had snapped completely shut, crushing the man who said it. The heavy brass doors of the federal courthouse swung shut, sealing out the noise of the city. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavily conditioned and perfectly sterile. The mahogany panels gleamed under the recessed lighting. This was not the chaotic, emotion-driven arena of the municipal family court. This was the federal domain. This was a theater of absolute, unforgiving facts. I took my seat in the front row of the gallery, directly behind the prosecution table. Bradley Vance sat beside me, his briefcase resting on the polished wood. Across the wide center aisle, Jared sat next to his lead defense attorney. Jared did not possess the manic, triumphant energy he had displayed during the conservatorship hearing. He looked physically diminished. His suit hung slightly loose on his frame. The crushing weight of the federal indictment and the pending state elder abuse charges had finally begun to fracture his arrogant posture. The trial commenced with the sharp strike of the judge's gavel. Jared's defense attorney stood up to deliver his opening statement. He was a man who billed thousands of dollars an hour to craft compelling illusions for wealthy criminals. He paced in front of the jury box, utilizing a soft, reasonable, highly calibrated tone. He did not attempt to deny that the financial transfers occurred. Instead, he attempted to completely rewrite the intent behind them. He painted a masterful, entirely fictitious portrait of my son. He described Jared as a relentless, overworked visionary, a technological genius carrying the immense weight of a billion-dollar company on his young shoulders. He argued that the pace of the global tech industry was blinding, requiring rapid, split-second financial maneuvering. The defense attorney then addressed the forged mortgage. He characterized it as a simple, unfortunate administrative error. He claimed Jared had tasked a negligent subordinate with securing a standard bridge loan and that in the chaotic rush of corporate expansion, the paperwork was mishandled. He explicitly stated there was no malice, only executive oversight. He then turned his focus toward me. He pointed a steady, accusing finger at the gallery. He attempted to assassinate my character with surgical precision. He painted me not as a victim, but as a deeply vengeful, overwhelmingly greedy father. He told the jury that I was a bitter man who could not handle his own son, eclipsing him in wealth and status. He argued that I was exploiting a minor paperwork technicality to violently seize control of a company I did not build, intentionally destroying my own flesh and blood to satisfy my massive ego. The jury listened intently. Some nodded in sympathy. The narrative of the stressed, brilliant entrepreneur targeted by a jealous parent was a compelling fiction. Jared sat at the defense table, nodding solemnly, playing the role of the misunderstood martyr with desperate dedication. The prosecution spent the next 3 days methodically laying their foundation. They presented the bank managers, the digital forensics experts, and the county clerk officials. They entered the IP logs and the offshore routing numbers into evidence. The defense attorney fought them at every turn, objecting, muddying the waters, and attempting to drown the jury in complex, confusing technical jargon. He wanted to make the financial data so incomprehensible that the jury would default to his narrative of an innocent administrative mistake. On the morning of the 4th day, the lead federal prosecutor called me to the witness stand. The courtroom fell into an absolute heavy silence as I walked down the center aisle. I climbed the short wooden staircase and raised my right hand, swearing to tell the truth. I sat in the leather witness chair and adjusted the microphone. I did not look at Jared. I looked directly at the 12 men and women sitting in the jury box. The prosecutor began with my professional background. I detailed my 30 years as a forensic auditor for the federal government. I established my absolute fluency in complex corporate finance. The prosecutor then asked me to explain the exact nature of the intellectual property at the center of Omniscient Technologies. I did not use emotional language. I used pure, unassailable facts. I explained that Esther Cole, my late wife, engineered the predictive data algorithm. I detailed the specific licensing agreement she had drafted, emphasizing the revocation clause contingent upon fiduciary duty and moral conduct. The prosecutor then pivoted to the core federal charges. He asked me to explain the mortgage forgery. Jared's defense attorney immediately stood up, objecting loudly, claiming the question required speculation. The judge overruled him. I leaned into the microphone. I did not give the defense attorney the confused, angry performance he desperately wanted. I gave the jury a masterclass in forensic accounting. I destroyed the administrative error defense completely. I recited the precise digital pathway of the stolen funds. I explained how the secondary lending portal was accessed using a virtual private network physically located within Jared's private executive suite. I detailed the exact timestamps matching Jared's personal electronic keycard entries. I explained how the $1.5 million did not go into a corporate operational account, but was instead routed through 3 separate offshore shell companies before depositing directly into his personal, untaxed offshore trust. I looked at the jury and explained that you do not accidentally route $1 million through the Cayman Islands to cover a corporate bridge loan. It requires deliberate, multi-stage criminal intent. Jared's defense attorney stood up for cross-examination. His face was flushed with frustration. His entire strategy relied on confusing the jury, but I had just illuminated the crime with terrifying clarity. He decided to abandon the financial argument and attack my credibility directly. He walked toward the witness stand holding the photographs from the family court injunction. The photographs of my burned, bandaged hands. He slammed them down on the wooden ledge in front of me. He raised his voice, adopting an aggressive, combative tone. He demanded I explain the severe injuries. He asked the jury how they could trust the testimony of a man who was so emotionally unstable, so consumed by irrational grief that he would violently plunge his bare hands into a roaring fireplace. He accused me of being a dangerous, erratic individual who was manufacturing a financial conspiracy to punish his son for moving forward with his life. The courtroom held its collective breath. The defense attorney stood waiting for my composure to break. I looked at the photographs of my ruined skin. I looked at Jared, who was staring at his desk, his face completely pale. I looked back at the defense attorney. My voice was perfectly steady, radiating a cold, devastating calm. I told the courtroom exactly what happened on the night of the housewarming party. I described the massive, multi-million-dollar mansion purchased with stolen money. I detailed the profound systemic disrespect Megan and Jared displayed. I did not omit a single detail. I told the jury about the quilt. I explained that it was hand-stitched by Esther, a woman who spent her life fighting for every inch of respect she possessed. I explained that it was the very last physical manifestation of her warmth and her legacy. I turned my gaze directly toward the jury box. I told them that my son, the man sitting at the defense table claiming to be an overworked visionary, looked me in the eye and threw his mother's legacy into a burning fire simply because I refused to let him steal my home. I explained that I did not suffer a psychotic break. I explained that I made a perfectly rational, highly calculated decision. I reached into the flames because the preservation of my wife's dignity was worth infinitely more than the flesh on my hands. I told them that the burns were not a sign of instability. They were the physical proof of my absolute commitment to truth and justice. I looked at the defense attorney. I asked him if he required any further clarification regarding my mental state or my motivations. The attorney stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He had no follow-up questions. He slowly walked back to the defense table and sat down heavily in his chair. He knew the trial was effectively over. The prosecution rested its case. The defense offered a weak, disorganized closing argument that completely failed to resonate. The judge delivered the final instructions and the jury was dismissed to the deliberation room. Federal fraud trials involving massive corporate structures and offshore accounts often require days or even weeks of intense deliberation. The financial data is dense and the burden of proof is exceptionally high. The courtroom remained tense and quiet. Jared sat with his head bowed, staring at the floor. He did not speak to his attorney. The arrogant, untouchable CEO was completely gone, replaced by a hollow shell of a man waiting for his inevitable destruction. We did not wait days, we did not even wait an entire afternoon. Exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes after the heavy wooden doors closed, the courtroom bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The rapid speed of the decision sent a physical shockwave through the room. A short deliberation is almost universally catastrophic for the defense. The jury filed back into the box. Their faces were set in expressions of grim, absolute certainty. The judge asked the jury foreman if they had reached a unanimous decision. The foreman stood up. He was a stern, older man holding a single sheet of paper. He confirmed that they had. He handed the folded document to the bailiff, who carried it across the room and handed it up to the judge. The judge opened the paper, read the contents silently, and then nodded. He handed it back to the bailiff to return to the foreman. Jared was ordered to stand and face the jury. His legs trembled so violently he had to grip the edge of the heavy wooden table just to remain upright. The foreman cleared his throat. He read the verdict aloud, his voice echoing clearly across the absolute silence of the federal courtroom. On the charge of wire fraud, guilty. On the charge of aggravated identity theft, guilty. On the charge of bank fraud, guilty. He read through all 14 federal counts. Every single word was a hammer blow driving the final nails into Jared's coffin. Guilty on all charges. Jared's knees gave out. He collapsed backward into his leather chair, a strangled guttural sob escaping his throat. The federal marshals immediately moved in, pulling him roughly to his feet and pulling his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the room one final time. I remained seated in the gallery. I watched the federal agents lead my son through the side door, taking him out of my life and into a concrete cell. I felt no regret. I felt no sorrow. The audit was finally complete. The books were perfectly balanced. The federal sentencing hearing took place exactly 6 weeks after the jury delivered their unanimous guilty verdict. The atmosphere inside the courtroom had fundamentally changed. During the trial, the air crackled with the frantic, desperate energy of a defense attorney trying to weave an illusion. Today, the air was entirely stagnant. The illusion was dead. The room was no longer a theater of debate. It was a factory of consequences. I sat in the front row of the gallery, occupying the exact same seat I had claimed during my testimony. I wore a dark, meticulously tailored charcoal suit. My hands were finally free of the white medical gauze, the burn scars healed into smooth, permanent silver lines across my knuckles. I rested my hands on my knees and watched the heavy side door of the courtroom open. Jared was escorted into the room by 2 heavily armed federal marshals. The visual transformation was absolute and devastating. The bespoke Italian wool and the expensive silk ties were permanently gone. He wore the standard drab olive uniform of a federal inmate holding facility. The fabric was stiff and unflattering. His wrists were chained to a heavy leather belt secured around his waist. His ankles were shackled, forcing him to walk with a slow, degrading shuffle. The man who had commanded boardrooms and manipulated billionaires now moved with the defeated obedience of a broken animal. The artificial charisma that had fueled his entire corporate existence had evaporated, leaving behind a pale, hollow, terrified shell. He sat at the defense table. He did not look at the gallery. He stared blankly at the polished wooden surface in front of him. The federal judge entered the courtroom. The entire room stood in absolute silence. The judge took his seat at the elevated mahogany bench. He was a man who had presided over hundreds of financial crime cases. He had seen every variation of corporate greed and executive fraud. But as he opened the thick sentencing dossier, his expression hardened into a mask of profound, unmistakable disgust. He did not begin with standard legal formalities. He looked directly down at Jared and delivered a scathing surgical reprimand. The judge stated that the financial magnitude of the wire fraud was severe, but the monetary theft was not the most egregious element of the crime. He told the silent courtroom that white-collar criminals often rationalize their actions through the sterile lens of corporate accounting. They view numbers on a screen as abstract concepts completely disconnected from human suffering. The judge leaned forward, resting his hands on the bench. He told Jared that his crimes transcended simple greed. He stated that the true measure of Jared's moral bankruptcy was not found in the forged signatures or the offshore bank accounts. It was found in the family court injunction. The judge's voice amplified through the courtroom speakers, heavy with righteous contempt. He recounted the precise details of the conservatorship attempt. He told the gallery that Jared had knowingly, maliciously attempted to weaponize the psychiatric and legal systems against his own father. He stated that trying to forcibly institutionalize an innocent grieving widower simply to cover up a trail of stolen money was an act of profound, chilling depravity. The judge highlighted the sheer cowardice required to look at a father's physical burn scars and cynically present them as evidence of senile dementia. He declared that Jared possessed no moral compass, no foundational ethics, and no capacity for rehabilitation outside of a heavily monitored federal environment. Jared sat completely motionless. He did not weep. He did not protest. The weight of the judge's words pressed down on him, flattening his spirit against the cold reality of his actions. The defense attorney stood up to make a final, obligatory plea for leniency, citing Jared's lack of prior criminal history. The judge dismissed the plea instantly. He stated that a lack of prior convictions did not excuse the breathtaking cruelty of the current offenses. The judge instructed Jared to stand. The heavy chains rattled loudly in the quiet room as Jared struggled to his feet. The judge read the final sentencing mandate. For the multiple counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and financial conspiracy, the court sentenced Jared to 144 months in a maximum security federal penitentiary. 12 years. There is no early parole in the federal prison system. The sentence was absolute. The judge struck his gavel. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. The execution of Jared's future was complete. But the mechanics of justice in that courtroom were not yet finished. Megan sat 3 rows behind the defense table. She wore a conservative, understated black dress. She had attended the sentencing believing she was entirely insulated from the blast radius. Since the night she fled my porch, she had successfully maintained the illusion of the victimized wife. She believed that because she had not directly forged the mortgage documents, she was immune to federal prosecution. She believed her frantic escape and her subsequent silence had shielded her from the consequences of her husband's collapse. She sat in the gallery waiting for the hearing to end so she could walk out of the building and quietly begin searching for a new wealthy host to parasitize. She severely underestimated the efficiency of the district attorney. As the judge concluded the sentencing and organized his files, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. 3 federal marshals walked purposefully down the center aisle. They did not move toward the defense table. They moved directly into the gallery. They stopped at the 3rd row. They stood over Megan. Megan looked up, her face instantly draining of color. The arrogant confidence she had worn like armor shattered into pure, unadulterated panic. The lead marshal ordered her to stand. He did not lower his voice. He informed her that she was being placed under immediate federal arrest. He stated the charges clearly for the entire courtroom to hear: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, aiding and abetting financial exploitation, and felony extortion. Megan gasped. She shook her head frantically, protesting loudly that there was a mistake. She claimed she knew nothing about Jared's business. She screamed that she was an innocent spouse. The lead marshal remained entirely unmoved. He pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. He calmly informed her that the district attorney had received a highly specific 20-minute audio recording. He stated that the recording contained her explicit, detailed confession of intimate knowledge regarding the offshore accounts. He informed her that the recording also captured her explicitly attempting to extort a federal witness for real estate and cash in exchange for manipulated testimony. Megan froze. Her eyes darted wildly around the room until they locked onto me. She looked at my face, realizing in that exact fraction of a second that the audio file I had transmitted from my porch had effectively signed her arrest warrant. The trap she had blindly walked into had finally snapped shut. The marshals grabbed her arms, pulling them behind her back. She did not fight them. Her legs gave way, forcing the marshals to physically drag her out of the wooden pew. The metallic click of her handcuffs echoed the exact sound that had just sealed her husband's fate. She was led up the aisle weeping uncontrollably, her curated life of luxury permanently extinguished. At the front of the courtroom, the marshals gripped Jared by the arms to lead him toward the holding cells. As he turned, his shuffling chain steps brought him to face the gallery. He stopped. The marshals tugged at his arms, but he resisted just long enough to look at me. The physical distance between us was less than 20 feet, but the chasm was infinite. He looked into my eyes. His face was slick with sweat and the absolute terror of a man who realized he would spend the next decade of his life locked in a concrete box. His expression was a silent, desperate plea. He was looking for a shred of the father who had raised him. He was searching for a glimmer of sorrow, a hint of regret, or even a flash of triumphant anger. He needed some emotional tether to anchor him, some sign that his destruction mattered to me on a primal level. I sat perfectly still. I felt the smooth, silver scars on my knuckles. I looked at the man in the olive jumpsuit. I did not feel pity. Pity is reserved for victims of circumstance, not architects of cruelty. I did not feel anger. Anger is a chaotic emotion that implies an ongoing struggle. The struggle was over. I felt nothing but a vast surgical detachment. I looked at him with the cold, absolute emptiness of a completed audit. I did not nod. I did not speak. I simply stood up from the wooden bench. I turned my back to him. I walked up the center aisle of the federal courtroom, my footsteps steady and measured. I pushed open the heavy brass doors and stepped out into the bright, unburdened sunlight, leaving my son entirely alone in the dark. The bright, unburdened sunlight of the courthouse plaza warmed my face. The heavy brass doors of the federal building closed behind me, sealing away the destruction of my son and his wife. I walked down the wide concrete steps. I did not look back. The audit was closed. The ledger was balanced. The cancer that had attempted to consume my life, my home, and my late wife's legacy had been surgically, permanently excised. I walked to my car with a steady, rhythmic stride. The city traffic moved around me, completely unaware of the multi-million-dollar empire that had just been legally dismantled inside that stone fortress. I got behind the wheel. I did not drive to the corporate headquarters. I did not drive to the bank to verify my newly unfrozen assets. I drove toward the narrow, bustling streets of the historic textile district. I had a final, far more important asset to reclaim. The bell above the glass door chimed a sharp, clear note as I entered Loretta's restoration shop. The air inside was thick with the scent of raw, cotton-oiled sewing machine gears and strong black tea. It was an environment of meticulous, quiet labor. It was a place where broken things were given a second life. Loretta stood behind the long wooden counter. She was a woman of exacting standards. She did not tolerate careless work. She looked up from her ledger and offered a single respectful nod. She knew exactly why I was there. She did not ask about the federal trial. She did not ask about my son. She only cared about the fabric. She turned and walked into the back room, her footsteps heavy and deliberate against the hardwood floor. I stood by the counter looking at my hands. The smooth silver scars across my knuckles were fully healed. They were the permanent physical record of my defense. The flesh had survived the fire. I waited to see if Esther's legacy had survived as well. Loretta returned carrying a large canvas protective bag. She placed it gently onto the smooth surface of the counter. She unzipped the heavy canvas. She did not pull the fabric out with a flourish. She drew it back slowly, treating the material with the profound reverence it demanded. I looked down at the restored quilt. The breath caught in my throat. I placed my scarred hands flat on the wooden counter to steady myself. Loretta had not attempted to hide the violence of Jared's attack. She had not tried to seamlessly weave new cotton over the charred, ruined sections. She understood that attempting to erase the damage would be an insult to the history of the object. Instead, she had integrated the destruction into a completely new, breathtakingly defiant pattern. The gaping, blackened holes where Jared had thrust the quilt into the roaring fireplace were gone. In their place, Loretta had meticulously stitched thick, dark-oiled leather patches. The rugged leather anchored the delicate cotton, providing a heavy protective armor over the wounds. She had used a brilliant, heavy golden thread to bind the leather to the original fabric. The golden stitches were thick, visible, and unapologetic. They traced the jagged edges of the burn marks like veins of solid metal. It was the Japanese philosophy of kintsugi applied to American textiles. The golden thread drew the eye directly to the damage, declaring that the object was fundamentally more beautiful and far more valuable because it had been broken and masterfully repaired. The quilt was no longer just a blanket. It was a visual manifesto of survival. It was heavier. It was infinitely stronger. It was a physical representation of endurance. I reached out and ran my fingers over the golden thread. I traced the boundary between Esther's original delicate stitching and Loretta's heavy protective leather. The contrast was perfect. Esther had built the foundation. She had engineered the original warmth and the intricate mathematical beauty of the patterns. When that foundation was violently attacked by the boundless greed of her own son, the damage had been sealed and fortified. The legacy had not burned. It had evolved. I looked up at Loretta. I did not need to speak. I simply nodded. She zipped the canvas bag closed and handed it to me. I paid her invoice in full, adding a massive gratuity that she initially tried to refuse. I insisted. True craftsmanship, the kind that restores dignity to violated history, is priceless. I carried the heavy canvas bag out to my car. I drove back to my quiet working-class neighborhood. The massive, fraudulent mansion Jared had purchased was miles away, currently being seized and liquidated by federal asset recovery teams. I parked in my driveway. I walked up the steps of my porch. I unlocked my front door and stepped into the profound, absolute silence of my home. The silence was no longer a void waiting to be filled by toxic family obligations. The silence was a fortress. The air was clean. The invasive parasitic energy of Jared and Megan was entirely eradicated from the space. I walked down the hallway to the master bedroom. I unzipped the canvas bag. I lifted the heavy leather-bound quilt and let it unfold across the mattress. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the window blinds, catching the thick golden thread. The metallic glint illuminated the dark leather patches. I stood at the foot of the bed and simply watched the light shift across the fabric. I remembered the nights Esther had sat in the corner chair, her hands moving with tireless mathematical precision as she built the original squares. I remembered her quiet determination. I remembered her absolute refusal to be diminished by a society that constantly attempted to reduce her worth. Her spirit was woven into the cotton. Jared had tried to burn that spirit to ashes to force my compliance. He had failed spectacularly. The quilt lay on the bed, heavy, warm, and entirely unbroken. Order was completely restored. My mind was quiet. My estate was secure. The threat was eliminated. The heavy metallic clatter of the brass mail slot dropping shut echoed down the hallway. The sound broke the perfect stillness of the afternoon. I turned away from the bed and walked back down the corridor toward the front door. A small stack of envelopes lay scattered on the entryway rug. I bent down and gathered the mail. I sifted through the standard utility bills and the junk mail advertisements. At the bottom of the stack was a thick brown manila envelope. The paper was cheap and rough. The top left corner bore the stark black ink stamp of the Regional Federal Correctional Facility. The handwriting scrawled across the center was erratic, desperate, and deeply familiar. It was Jared's handwriting. He had bypassed the digital communication systems of the prison. He had bypassed his expensive defense attorneys. He had written directly to the home he had attempted to steal. I walked into the kitchen and sat at the table. I slid my thumb under the glued flap of the envelope and tore it open. 3 pages of lined yellow legal paper slid out onto the wood. The handwriting was frantic, filling every available millimeter of the page. There were no arrogant demands. There were no corporate ultimatums. There was only the raw, pathetic panic of a man who had suddenly realized the concrete walls closing around him were permanent. Jared was begging. He wrote that his accounts were entirely frozen. He wrote that Megan had abandoned him the exact second she was indicted, turning state's evidence in a desperate, futile attempt to reduce her own sentence. He wrote that the federal commissary accounts required outside funding for basic hygienic necessities. He was begging for a financial deposit. He was begging for a designated visitor slot. He pleaded for a single brief phone call. He claimed he needed a chance to explain his actions, a chance to apologize, a chance to make me understand the crushing pressure he had been under. He claimed he was still my son. I read the 3 pages of desperate, crawling manipulation. I looked at the sloppy ink and the pathetic pleas for survival money. I thought of the millions of dollars he had routed through offshore shell companies to fund European sports cars and leased diamonds. I thought of the family court judge he had attempted to weaponize against my sanity. I felt absolutely nothing. I folded the 3 yellow pages perfectly in half. I placed them back inside the cheap manila envelope. I stood up from the table, walked to the mechanical shredder sitting in my home office, and fed the envelope directly into the steel blades. The sound of the grinding gears filled the room, reducing his final desperate connection to my life into thousands of unreadable paper ribbons. The federal penitentiary sat isolated in a vast expanse of flat, barren land. It was a brutal architecture of concrete and razor wire designed to contain the consequences of human failure. I drove my car through the heavy steel gates. I parked in the visitor lot. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the primary security checkpoint. I emptied my pockets. I surrendered my belt and my shoes. I walked through the metal detectors. I allowed the guards to scan my body and stamp the back of my hand with invisible ultraviolet ink. I moved with the practiced, detached rhythm of a man who had visited dozens of these facilities throughout his professional career. I was not intimidated by the sterile, oppressive environment. I was merely completing the final step of a comprehensive audit. The visitor hall was a long, echoing room divided by a thick wall of reinforced bulletproof glass. Rows of plastic chairs were bolted to the linoleum floor on both sides of the partition. I found my assigned booth. I sat down in the rigid plastic chair. I placed my heavy leather briefcase on the narrow steel counter in front of me. I waited. The heavy steel doors on the opposite side of the room clattered open. A line of inmates in drab olive jumpsuits filed into the visitor area. They were escorted by armed correctional officers. Jared was the third man in the line. The physical deterioration was profound. The arrogant glow of the billionaire technology executive was completely eradicated. His skin was pale and sallow from a lack of natural sunlight. His posture was hunched. He walked with a slow, defeated shuffle. He spotted me sitting behind the glass. A sudden, desperate spark of hope ignited in his dull eyes. He believed my presence was a sign of capitulation. He believed the shredded letter had achieved its intended manipulation. He believed a father could not simply abandon a son to a concrete cell. He hurried to the booth. He sat down heavily in the plastic chair. He grabbed the black telephone receiver mounted to the wall. His hand was trembling violently. I picked up my receiver. The line hissed with a cheap metallic static. Jared did not wait for me to speak. He launched immediately into a frantic, breathless monologue. He pressed his face close to the thick glass. He forced a smile that looked like a painful grimace. He thanked me for coming. He swore he knew I would not leave him to rot. He swore he understood the gravity of his mistakes. He started to cry. The tears rolled down his pale cheeks. He wiped them away with the rough fabric of his olive jumpsuit. He immediately transitioned from gratitude to justification. He began to systematically dismantle his own culpability. He blamed the relentless pressure of the venture capital market. He claimed the board of directors demanded impossible profit margins. He claimed the shadow lenders had threatened his life, forcing him into a state of blind panic. He then pivoted the entirety of his blame onto his wife. He painted Megan as a financial parasite. He claimed her relentless greed and insatiable demand for luxury had drained his accounts. He swore she had threatened to destroy his reputation if he did not maintain their lavish lifestyle. He claimed he only forged the mortgage to satisfy her manic demands. He cast himself as a desperate, overworked visionary trapped in a toxic marriage, making a single tragic administrative error to save his family. He paused his frantic monologue. He pressed his hand against the bulletproof glass. He begged for a financial deposit into his commissary account. He begged me to hire an appellate attorney to fight the federal conviction. He swore that if I gave him a second chance, he would rebuild the company the right way. He swore he would make Esther proud. I sat perfectly still. I held the black receiver to my ear. I did not speak. I did not offer a single syllable of validation, comfort, or absolution. I listened to his voice crackle over the cheap wire. My silence was not born of shock or sorrow. My silence was born of profound professional recognition. I spent 30 years operating as a senior forensic auditor for the federal government. I spent 3 decades sitting across from men identical to Jared. I had sat in sterile interrogation rooms and watched wealthy, powerful executives collapse into tears when the financial evidence was presented. I had listened to hundreds of frantic monologues blaming market pressure, greedy spouses, and negligent subordinates. I knew the precise anatomy of a corporate confession. I knew the fundamental difference between genuine regret and calculated survival strategy. A man experiencing true remorse takes absolute ownership of his destruction. He does not distribute his guilt. He does not point fingers at his partners or his spouse. He accepts the devastation he caused, and he accepts the punishment. Jared was not experiencing remorse. Jared was experiencing the agonizing friction of a narcissist trapped in an environment he could no longer control. His tears were not shed for the desecration of his mother's memory. His tears were not shed for the theft of my property. His tears were shed entirely for his own lost liberty. He was not apologizing. He was strategizing. He was utilizing the memory of Esther as a psychological lever to extract commissary funds and legal fees. I watched his face contort as my silence stretched into a second minute. The desperate smile faltered. The frantic energy began to sour into rising panic. He needed a reaction. He needed a lifeline. He gripped the black receiver with both hands. He pleaded with me to say something. He begged me to speak. He demanded to know why I had come to the prison if I was not going to help him. The silence was absolute. The silence was final. I lowered the black telephone receiver from my ear. I placed it gently onto the metal rest. I did not break eye contact with the man behind the glass. I reached out and unclasped the brass locks of my leather briefcase. The sharp click of the metal echoed softly in my booth. I opened the heavy leather flap. I reached inside and retrieved a single thick document. It was printed on heavy, high-quality archival paper. The top page bore the embossed golden seal of the state corporate registry. I did not hold the document up for him to read through the glass. I placed it flat on the narrow steel counter. I slid it forward. I pushed the thick stack of paper through the narrow horizontal steel slot located at the base of the bulletproof partition. The document slid smoothly across the polished metal and emerged on Jared's side of the barrier. Jared dropped his telephone receiver. It dangled by its armored cord, swaying back and forth against the wall. He lunged forward. He snatched the document from the steel slot with trembling, eager hands. He believed it was a cashier's check. He believed it was a signed retainer agreement from a high-powered appellate law firm. He believed it was the instrument of his salvation. He flipped to the first page. His eyes scanned the heavy black text. The color drained entirely from his face. His hands stopped trembling and went completely rigid. He stopped breathing. He was holding the newly minted, legally binding corporate charter for Esther's technology firm. The document detailed a total, irreversible structural reorganization of the company. It outlined the absolute transfer of all intellectual property, predictive algorithms, and historical patents into an irrevocable trust. It designated a new independent board of directors comprised entirely of external vetted software engineers and forensic data scientists. The charter explicitly legally barred Jared from ever holding a position, owning a share, or claiming association with the company in any capacity in perpetuity. It detailed the creation of a massive philanthropic wing dedicated to funding minority women in computer science, cementing Esther's legacy in a fortress of impenetrable legal protection. The document explicitly stated that the trust could never be dissolved. It mandated that all future profits would forever bypass any potential heir who possessed a felony conviction for financial fraud. It was a masterpiece of corporate architecture designed to obliterate his standing in the technological world. The document was not a lifeline, it was a tombstone. It was the final undeniable proof that his empire was permanently gone and his mother's legacy was forever beyond his corrupting reach. He stared at the golden seal. He looked up at me. His mouth opened, but he could not generate a single sound. The reality of his absolute total erasure from the world he had tried to steal finally crushed the remaining breath from his lungs. I picked up my briefcase. I fastened the brass locks. I stood up from the plastic chair. I turned my back on the thick bulletproof glass. I walked out of the visitor hall, leaving the man in the olive jumpsuit trapped alone with the undeniable truth of his own destruction. Jared's eyes locked onto the second page of the corporate charter. The thick, embossed archival paper trembled violently within his chained hands. He was a man entirely accustomed to skimming complex financial instruments, always searching for the hidden leverage, the backdoor equity, the golden parachute. He read with the frantic, desperate speed of a cornered predator. He scanned the dense legal paragraphs detailing the total structural reorganization of omniscient technologies. His mind desperately tried to map a counter-strategy. He looked for the buyout clauses. He looked for the shareholder voting rights. He looked for the executive compensation packages. He scoured the text for any vulnerability he could exploit through litigation. He found absolutely nothing. The document detailed a complete and irrevocable transition. I had not simply fired Jared or transferred the voting shares to a new corporate entity. I had weaponized the absolute highest tiers of federal trust law against him. Omniscient Technologies no longer existed as a for-profit corporate entity. It had been legally dissolved and immediately resurrected as a heavily fortified 501c3 nonprofit trust. Every single patent, every line of predictive algorithmic code, every proprietary data model Esther had ever engineered was now securely locked within the impenetrable vault of the Esther Cole Foundation. Jared's pale lips moved silently as he read the strict disbursement mandates. He reached the section outlining the new operational directive. The algorithm was still functioning flawlessly. It was still generating hundreds of millions of dollars in licensing revenue from global tech conglomerates. But that staggering revenue would never again purchase a European luxury sports car. It would never fund an offshore gambling account or a fraudulent real estate acquisition. The charter dictated that 100% of the generated profits were to be immediately and permanently redirected into a massive educational endowment. The money was legally bound to provide comprehensive full-ride scholarships for underprivileged African American students pursuing advanced degrees in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I watched his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated horror. I sat perfectly still behind the thick partition, observing the exact moment my son realized his empire was entirely gone. I had spent weeks working relentlessly with the finest estate attorneys in the country to ensure the trust was completely bulletproof. I had utilized my 30 years of forensic auditing experience to anticipate and block every conceivable legal challenge. I had thought deeply about Esther while drafting the charter. I remembered the decades she spent fighting for a single seat at the table. I remembered the countless nights she sat under the dim glow of her desk lamp, her hands moving with tireless mathematical precision. I remembered the stack of rejection letters from arrogant venture capitalists who refused to fund an African-American woman even when her predictive models drastically outperformed their entire analytical portfolios. She was a brilliant, innovative engineer operating in a technological landscape that actively attempted to marginalize her existence. She had built her breakthroughs while sitting at our scratched kitchen table, balancing our meager checkbook and fighting for every ounce of professional respect she possessed. Jared had inherited the immense financial rewards of her suffering, but he had entirely rejected her morality. He viewed her towering intellect merely as a sterile asset to be exploited. He viewed his own mother as a convenient stepping stone to his unearned corporate throne. I decided that the billions of dollars her mind generated should no longer serve the son who had fundamentally betrayed her. The wealth would now serve her true heirs. It would serve the young, brilliant minds sitting at their own scratched kitchen tables, fighting against the exact same systemic barriers she had faced. The algorithms would fund their tuition, their housing, and their autonomous research grants. Esther's legacy would multiply exponentially across generations of innovators. Jared would not receive a single cent. Jared reached the final page. The document explicitly barred him from ever contesting the trust. He was permanently exiled from the board of directors. The realization crashed down upon him with the crushing weight of a collapsed building. The offshore accounts were entirely seized by federal agents. His personal assets were frozen to pay the massive government restitution. The algorithm was gone. The company was gone. His entire identity, carefully constructed upon a fragile foundation of stolen genius and arrogant entitlement, evaporated into absolute nothingness. The heavy paper slipped from his trembling fingers. It fluttered down to the cold floor of his holding booth. He stared at me through the thick, bulletproof glass. The manufactured corporate charm was permanently erased. The manipulative, pleading tears were gone. His face contorted into a dark mask of pure, unfiltered, animalistic rage. He opened his mouth and let out a guttural, furious scream. The sound was heavily muffled by the thick acoustic partition, reducing his towering fury to a pathetic, distant echo. He lunged forward with sudden, violent force. He slammed his shackled fists against the glass. The heavy metal chains rattled violently as he struck the impenetrable barrier again and again. He screamed obscenities. He cursed my name. He cursed the ironclad trust. He cursed the memory of the woman who had given him life. He behaved exactly like a spoiled, tyrannical child who had finally been told no by an authority he could not bribe or intimidate. The correctional officers standing at the back of the visitor hall immediately stepped forward. They unclipped their heavy batons and moved toward his booth with sharp, aggressive tactical efficiency. They did not tolerate tantrums in the federal penitentiary. I did not flinch. I did not lean away from the glass. I watched him strike the partition, his face red and distorted with uncontrollable wrath. I had spent my entire career tracking financial criminals who believed they were inherently smarter than the system. I had watched them all break down when the final undeniable audit was presented. Jared was no different. He was not a visionary. He was not a technological genius. He was simply a thief who had finally run out of shadows to hide in. I stood up from the rigid plastic chair. I smoothed the lapels of my dark charcoal suit, aligning the fabric with slow, deliberate precision. I reached out and picked up the black communication phone one last time. The line crackled with cheap static, carrying the sound of Jared's heavy, frantic breathing and the sharp, shouted commands of the approaching guards ordering him to step back from the glass. Jared pressed his face against the partition, his eyes wild, bloodshot, and brimming with desperate hatred. He gripped his receiver, waiting for me to speak. He was waiting for a lengthy justification. He was waiting for a bitter argument. He desperately wanted a final emotional confrontation to validate his explosive anger. I looked directly into his eyes. My voice was perfectly calm, utterly devoid of emotion, and sharp as a surgical scalpel. Trash does not belong in my empire. I placed the receiver firmly back onto the metal hook. The line went dead with a sharp, definitive click. I turned my back to the glass. Behind me, I could hear the muffled thud of the correctional officers physically restraining Jared, dragging him away from the partition as he continued to thrash and scream against the inevitable reality of his incarceration. I did not look back. I picked up my heavy leather briefcase, snapped the brass locks securely into place, and walked down the center aisle of the visitor hall. I moved with the steady, unburdened stride of a man who had successfully defended his home and completely restored order. The heavy polished brass key felt cold against my palm. I stood alone in the grand foyer of the sprawling six-bedroom mansion Jared had purchased using the stolen $1.5 million. The cavernous space, previously echoing with the manufactured laughter and clinking champagne glasses of Megan's housewarming party, was completely silent. The expensive art pieces, the designer furniture, and the imported rugs had all been seized and liquidated by the federal government. The marble floors reflected only the afternoon sunlight pouring through the massive arched windows. I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing against the vaulted ceilings. This was the fortress Jared had built to display his fraudulent wealth. It was a monument to his arrogance. Now it was entirely hollow. I did not intend to keep the mansion. I had zero desire to occupy a space built on the desecration of Esther's legacy. Retaining the property would mean allowing the rot Jared introduced to linger in my life. I was there to complete the final phase of the audit. I was there to balance the ledger permanently. I walked into the massive sunlit living room. The grand stone-carved fireplace dominated the far wall. This was the exact location where Jared had looked me in the eye and violently hurled his mother's hand-stitched quilt into the roaring flames. The hearth was completely cold now, swept clean of the ashes. I stood in front of the stone structure looking at my hands. The silver burn scars across my knuckles gleamed faintly in the light. The memory of the searing heat and the smell of burning cotton briefly flashed across my mind. I felt no lingering trauma. I felt only the quiet, resolute satisfaction of a man who had successfully defended his perimeter. The fire had not destroyed me, it had clarified my purpose. A sharp knock echoed through the empty foyer. I turned away from the fireplace and walked toward the heavy double doors. I opened them to find a woman in her late 30s standing on the porch. She held a thick leather portfolio. She was the regional director of the Community Housing Trust, a nonprofit organization dedicated to acquiring large properties and converting them into subsidized multifamily housing units for low-income residents. She offered a polite, professional smile. I extended my hand. We walked into the empty foyer together. She looked around the cavernous space, her eyes calculating the structural potential. I did not engage in unnecessary small talk. I withdrew a heavy manila folder from my briefcase. I handed her the complete transfer deeds, the signed federal release forms, and the final property title. I had authorized the direct sale of the mansion to the Community Housing Trust for precisely $1. I explained that the property was legally unencumbered and immediately available for structural conversion. I told her that the foundation funding the purchase would also cover the entire cost of the architectural remodeling required to transform the sprawling singular residence into 10 separate functional family apartments. The director reviewed the documents, her professional composure fracturing slightly as she registered the immense scale of the donation. She attempted to express profound gratitude, trying to find the appropriate words to acknowledge the financial magnitude of the transfer. I raised my hand, gently silencing her. I told her that the house had been built on a foundation of theft and profound disrespect. I explained that converting it into a resource for families fighting for stability was the only acceptable method of sanitizing the space. I asked her to sign the final transfer agreement. She did. The ink dried. The mansion officially ceased to be a monument to my son's greed. It became a community asset. I walked the director to her car. I handed her the heavy brass key. I watched her drive away, the tires of her modest sedan crunching against the expensive gravel of the long driveway. The massive, fraudulent estate was no longer my concern. I got into my car. I drove away from the manicured lawns and the towering iron gates of the exclusive neighborhood. I drove back toward the working-class streets of my own community. The drive felt remarkably short. The heavy, oppressive weight of the federal trial, the financial conspiracy, and the agonizing betrayal had finally lifted. The air inside my car felt clean. I pulled into the narrow driveway of my single-story wooden house. I parked the car and turned off the engine. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, simply looking at the structure. The paint was slightly faded. The front steps creaked underfoot. The roof needed new shingles. It was exactly the kind of house Megan had mocked with relentless, venomous disdain. It was not a status symbol. It was a home. It was the exact place where Esther and I had built a life based on mutual respect, quiet endurance, and unshakable loyalty. I walked up the wooden steps. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of old wood, roasted coffee beans, and dried lavender immediately enveloped me. The house was perfectly still. I walked into the small kitchen. I filled the glass carafe with cold water and turned on the coffee machine. I listened to the rhythmic, comforting sound of the water boiling and dripping through the dark ground beans. I walked down the short hallway into the master bedroom.